The first thing he felt was the cold. Not the winter cold outside the window, when you can just put on a jacket and turn on the heater. It was the kind of cold that crept into his bones and gnawed at them from the inside like a hungry animal. The second thing he felt was pain. His whole body ached as if he'd been run through an industrial press and they'd forgotten to turn it off. The third thing he felt was someone's small, icy fingers on his face. Someone was stroking his cheek and was quietly sobbing. He opened his eyes. A gray sky loomed above him. No, not the sky. The ceiling, if you could call it a ceiling. Rotten logs lay on crooked supports, with gaps a finger's width wide gaping between them. The wind blew through the cracks, carrying fine, prickly snow with it. He turned his head. A girl was kneeling beside him. Small, skinny, green. Her skin was green, not from illness and not from paint. Real green skin the color of young moss. Yellow eyes with vertical pupils. Two small fangs jutted from her lower jaw. One was broken off halfway. She clutched a tattered blanket made of something resembling goat skin to her chest and looked at him with such horror as if he had already died and then changed his mind. She was saying something. He didn't immediately understand that he understood her words. She said he hadn't woken up for 3 days. She said her father had told her not to waste food on him. She said she'd left him water anyway. She said he couldn't die because he'd promised to show her how to catch fish in the summer. He raised his hand to touch her face. His hand was green, thin, with black nails and knuckles that jutted out like mountain ridges beneath the skin. It wasn't his hand. He sat up with a jolt, and the world before his eyes went blurry. A hut. He was sitting in a hut. Walls of clay mixed with straw. A dirt floor. The remains of a fire smoldered in the corner. There was more smoke than fire because the chimney wasn't drawing properly. He automatically looked up and found the reason. The chimney opening in the roof was clogged with snow and ice. Half the smoke was flowing back into the room. Carbon monoxide. These creatures were sleeping in poisoned air and didn't even know it. He looked at his hands again. Green. Thin. Childlike. 14 years old. Maybe 15. He didn't know where that number came from, but it seemed right. Just like the language the girl was speaking. Just like the name she kept repeating over and over. Groom. She called him Groom. His name was Daniel Pack. He was 34 years old. He was a civil engineer from Seattle, a specialist in bridges and reinforced structures in earthquake-prone areas. 10 years of experience, 16 projects, 3 patents for a horizontal load compensation system. And the last thing he remembered was the crack of rebar overhead and the thought that he'd been right, that the truss wouldn't hold, that he'd written about it in 3 damn reports and no one had listened to him. And then he died. And then he woke up here, in the body of a green teenager, in a mud hut with a rotting roof, next to a crying girl with a broken canine tooth. He closed his eyes and opened them again. Nothing had changed. The girl was still looking at him. He asked her name, even though he already knew the answer. She replied that her name was Nahi. She asked if he remembered his own name. He looked at her. Then at the wall behind her. The north wall had sagged, by about 15 centimeters to the eye. There was no foundation. They had simply packed down the earth and built a wall of unfired clay on top of it. Groundwater was eroding the base with every rain. The roof's load-bearing beam was rotting where it joined the support post because the wood lay directly on the ground without any waterproofing. He saw all this as clearly as he saw the blueprint on the computer screen. Stress lines, failure points, load vectors. The building before him was not a house. It was a survival challenge with an answer that only he knew. He replied that his name was Groom, and that this roof would not collapse today. Nahi began to cry, but differently. Not out of fear, but because she believed him. He stood up. His legs buckled and he grabbed hold of a support pillar. The post swayed. His fingers sank 1.5 centimeters into the soft wood. Rot had spread from the base and had already reached the middle. One more heavy snowfall and the roof would come crashing down right on Nahi. He stepped outside. The light hit his eyes. The world around him was white and gray. The steppe stretched to the horizon, where it met a dark strip of coniferous forest. The snow lay unevenly, the wind blew it away from open areas and piled it into drifts against the walls. The settlement consisted of about 40 huts, scattered without any order. No layout, no logic. Everyone built wherever they wanted and however they could. The palisade around the settlement was made of damp logs dug into the ground. Half of it had tilted. 3 sections were simply lying on the ground, and no one had bothered to pick them up. Orcs were walking among the huts. Green-skinned creatures ranging from 1.5 to 2.5 meters in height. Broad-shouldered, heavy, with fangs and rough faces. They were hauling bundles of firewood and frozen meat. Someone was sharpening an axe at the entrance to a hut. 2 were fighting over an empty cauldron. Not to the death, just a habit of figuring out who gets to eat first. He stood barefoot in the snow and watched it all. Inside, the engineer was doing the math. 40 structures. Average condition. A 3 on a 10-point scale. Population, at a glance. 200. Maybe 250. Of those, about 60 men fit for combat. Food supplies, judging by the gaunt bodies and empty drying racks, would last 2 to 3 weeks at most. The palisade wouldn't hold up against even an organized assault by 20 people. The water supply was a stream 100 meters away that would freeze completely in a month. He stood there, looking at the settlement of doomed creatures, and thought he'd seen something like this before, in photographs of slums, in slides at the university. The problem wasn't that there was a lack of resources here. There was stone. There was wood. There was clay. The problem was that no one knew what to do with them. 1,000 years of trial and error had given them huts made of shit and sticks. But in his head were thousands of years of others' experience compressed into 10 years of study and practice. He knew how drainage worked. He knew why a foundation was necessary. He knew what lime mortar was and how to make it from riverstone. He knew how to build a wall so it would stand for 100 years, not just 2 seasons. His feet were freezing. He went back inside. Nahi was waiting for him. She covered the spot where he had slept with every hide she could find. He looked at her and asked where his father was. She replied that he was in the smithy. He asked if it was far. She pointed in the direction. 3 huts to the east. He set off. The smithy turned out to be the sturdiest building in the settlement. And that was no compliment. It was simply that the walls were thicker, otherwise the heat from the smelter would have burned through the clay. Inside stood an orc. Over 2 meters tall, shoulders like a buffalo's, arms as thick as a teenager's thigh, blackened skin on his palms from burns. He was striking a piece of metal with a hammer, and each blow sounded like a gunshot. Krogar, the father of this body, the blacksmith of the cracked stone tribe. He didn't even turn around when Groom entered. Groom stood and waited. He looked at the forge through the eyes of an engineer. The forge was primitive, a stone pit with hand-operated bellows. One orc pumped the bellows with both hands to keep the fire going. The temperature, by eye, barely reached 900 degrees. For good steel, you need at least 1,200. The anvil was just a large, flat stone. There were 5 tools: a hammer, a pair of tongs, 2 chisels, and a trimming knife. Everything was crude. Everything was on the verge of breaking. Krogar finished forging. He turned around. He looked down at Groom. There was neither love nor hate in his gaze. There was something worse: indifference. He saw before him a frail son who couldn't lift a hammer and couldn't stand in formation. A useless mouth in a tribe where every mouth must be justified. Groom said the hut was sagging. Krogar said nothing. Groom said the support beam had rotted and the roof might collapse. Krogar shrugged. He replied that the spirits decide what stands and what falls. Groom felt something familiar rising inside him. The same anger that had burned within him on that bridge. The same fury toward people who ignore the obvious and hide behind whatever excuse they can find just to avoid thinking. Back then, they'd use the budget as an excuse. Here, they were using the spirits. He took a deep breath. He couldn't shout. He couldn't give orders. He was a frail teenager standing before a 2-meter-tall blacksmith who could break him with one hand. There was only one thing he could do: show them. He asked for 3 things: a night, 3 assistants, and access to the riverbed beyond the settlement. For the next 3 days, Groom didn't sleep. He walked through the settlement and counted. 41 huts. 237 orcs, including children. Of those, 48 children under 10. 17 elders over 50 by orc standards. 6 10-1 warriors fit for battle. The rest were women and teenagers. 18 days' worth of meat. No grain at all. Just a little salt left at the bottom of one barrel. He wrote everything down with a stick on the trampled snow near the smithy. He drew a map of the settlement from memory. He marked every structure. He assigned ratings from 1 to 5. A 1 meant the house would collapse in the next strong wind. A 5 meant the house would hold out until spring. There were no 5s. There were 2 4s, and both were the smithy and the chieftain's hut. Everything else ranged between a 1 and a 3. People followed him around. At first, there were 2 teenagers who helped out at night. Their names were Targ and Bernie. Targ was skinny and lanky, with his mouth perpetually open and a habit of asking questions to which there were no answers. Bernie was stocky and quiet, with hands that could bend an iron rod. They followed Groom like 2 shadows and watched as he drew with a stick in the snow. Targ asked what the lines meant. Groom replied that they were houses. Targ asked why he would draw a house when he could just look at it. Groom paused and thought. How could he explain the concept of a drawing to a creature that had never seen paper? He crouched down and drew a square. He said that this was Targ's hut, if viewed from above. He drew a circle inside it. He said it was the hearth. He drew a line from the hearth to the edge of the square. He said that was where the smoke should come out. Then he drew another square next to it. He said it was his neighbor's hut, and he drew a line between them. He said that if rainwater runs off the first house onto the second house will get wet and rot, even if it's built well. That's why you need to know where each house is located. Targ looked at the drawing in the snow. Then he looked at the real huts. Then back at the drawing. His mouth closed. For the first time since they'd met. He said he understood. Water from old Mogra's roof flows straight toward his mother's house, and every spring their wall gets waterlogged. Groom nodded. That's exactly right. On the 4th day, he received his first request. A woman named Gala, as broad as a wardrobe, with 2 children in her arms and a bruise under her eye. Her hut stood at the lowest point in the settlement. Every time it rained or the snow melted, water flowed there. The floor was perpetually wet. The children had been coughing since fall. She didn't ask. Orcs don't ask. She said she'd heard about the blacksmith's hut, and that if Hrogar's son was so smart, he should take a look. There was no hope in her voice. There was only weariness. Groom came. He inspected the hut. The problem was elementary from a construction standpoint and catastrophic from a health standpoint. The house stood in a natural watershed. All the water from the 3 neighboring slopes flowed toward it. The floor was earthen and had soaked up moisture like a sponge. The air was thick with the smell of mold. Gala's children sat in a corner on wet animal hides, coughing with wheezes that made Groom clench his teeth. He could imagine what the doctor would say. Bronchitis, maybe pneumonia. In a world without antibiotics, that's a death sentence. He ran the numbers in his head. He needed a drainage ditch higher up the slope to intercept the water before it reached the house. Divert it toward the stream. Raise the floor inside. Pour a layer of gravel, then a layer of compacted clay. Between them, a layer of dry pine needles for insulation. That's 2 days' work for 4 people. He told Gal that he'd fix it. She looked at him as if he'd said he'd stop winter. Then she silently went out and returned with a piece of dried meat. She held it out to him. Groom wanted to refuse. He looked at her face and took it. In this world, food was the highest currency. Refusal would have been an insult. He called for Targa and Bernie. Another teenager arrived, a girl named Shaka. She was sturdy for her age, with short hair and fierce eyes. She didn't say why she'd come. She just stood there and waited for someone to hand her a shovel. They dug for 2 days. The ditch ran 20 paces above the house and carried the water northeast toward a natural hollow that led to a stream. Inside, they raised the floor by 3 palms. Gravel, pine needles, clay. They tamped it down until it was as hard as stone. Groom personally checked every corner with his palm. It was dry. When Gala returned and set the children down on the new floor, she stood there silently for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor. She just sat there. She ran her hand over the dry clay. Her children stopped coughing after 3 days. Word got around. 3 families came the next morning. Then 2 more. By the end of the first week, Groom had 6 projects underway. He established a system. A morning inspection every day. Planning for the next day every evening. Targ memorized what needed to be brought. Bernie hauled stones. Shaka dug and silently struck anyone who tried to interfere. The problems were the same everywhere. No drainage, no foundation. Rotting wood at the base of the walls. Vent holes blocked or positioned so that smoke couldn't escape. Earthen floors saturated with moisture. He solved each of these problems with the same set of techniques. A ditch, gravel, stone bedding, and proper placement of the floor. It wasn't magic. It was the first course in the construction department. But to the orcs, it looked like a miracle. On the 5th day, a shaman came to him. Urzel appeared without warning. A tall, thin orc with long white hair braided into plaits. Bones and stones hung around his neck. His eyes were yellow and unblinking, like a lizard's. He stood there watching as Groom drew up a plan for a drainage system for an entire neighborhood. Not just one house, but 8 houses at once. A single ditch with branches that carried water away from all 8 buildings to a single collector. Urzel watched for a long time. Then he asked who had taught Groom to do this. Groom replied that no one had. That he himself could see how water flows and how to make it flow where it needed to go. Urzel said nothing. His silence weighed heavier than words. He turned and walked away. Groom realized he had just made his first enemy. Not because Urzel was evil, but because Groom was doing what, in the shaman's view, only spirits could do. A man who controls water. A man who straightens walls. A man who knows why a roof is collapsing and how to stop it. To Urzel, this was either magic that Groom had stolen from the spirits or heresy that undermined the entire order of the world. Both deserved death. But Urzula was clever. He didn't act right away. He waited. On the 6th day, Groom met Rika. He came to the sanctuary. A round hut, larger than the others, with animal skulls on the walls and a totem pole at the entrance. Inside, a ritual fire was burning. Smoke filled the room from floor to ceiling. Groom stepped inside, and within a minute his eyes began to water. 3 minutes later, he was coughing. He couldn't understand how anyone could even be. Rika was sitting by the fire. Her red braids reached her waist. She had tattoos of spirits on her arms. 16 years old. Urzula's daughter. A future shaman. She sat in the smoke with red eyes and streaks of tears on her cheeks, pretending that this was how it was supposed to be. She asked what he wanted. He replied that he wanted to look at the roof of the sanctuary. She said that men were not allowed to touch the sacred place. He replied that he had no intention of touching it, just looking. She reluctantly gave her permission. He walked around the sanctuary on the outside. The problem was obvious. The smoke vent was small and not centered above the fire, but offset toward the wall. Warm smoke rose upward, but missed the vent and pooled under the ceiling. Then it cooled and sank back down. A classic draft problem. The solution was simple: a chimney. Not just a hole in the roof, but a guided channel. A clay pipe above the fire that collects the hot smoke and directs it upward. The narrowing at the outlet accelerates the flow, the Venturi effect. He couldn't explain it in terms anyone here would understand, but he could build it. He went back inside. Rika watched him through the smoke. He said he could make the smoke go up. She replied that smoke was the breath of the spirits and that he couldn't command the spirits. He said he wasn't going to command them. He was going to give the spirits a path upward, so it would be easier for them to rise to the sky. Rika fell silent. He saw something change in her eyes. Not distrust, not agreement, curiosity. She said that if the smoke cleared, she would see the flame clearly, that the rituals would be better because she would be able to read the signs of the fire without tears in her eyes. She said she would talk to her father. Groom nodded. He knew Urzel would refuse, but the seed had been planted. On the 7th day, Kargash found him, the older brother of this body. A head taller than Groom and 3 times as heavy, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and small, angry eyes. He found Groom by the stream as he was gathering flat stones for another foundation. Kargash grabbed him by the chest and lifted him like a kitten. His face was a centimeter from Groom's. He said that Groom was bringing shame on their family, that an orc doesn't crawl in the mud or draw with a stick, that his father had become strange because of him, that if Groom didn't stop, Kargash would break both his arms so he could never draw again. Groom hung in the air and felt the collar digging into his throat. His body was weak. His hands couldn't break Kargash's grip, but his mind was working. He didn't argue. Groom spent 2 days looking for a spot for the well. He walked through the settlement and the surrounding area, studying the ground as he'd been taught. Where the grass breaks through the snow earlier in winter than in other places, the water is close to the surface. Where the soil remains slightly softer than the surrounding area even in the frost, groundwater warms it from below. He found 3 possible locations. One was too close to the outhouses. Contamination was inevitable. The second was on a slope, and reinforcing the walls would have required twice as much material. The third was ideal. A level spot in the center of the settlement, 20 paces from the smithy, far enough from the outhouses. The soil was dense but not rocky. By all indications, the water should be at a depth of 4 to 5 meters. He gathered his team in the morning. Targ, Bernie, Shaka, and 2 more newcomers. A young orc named Crag who joined after Groom repaired his wife's house, and old Moog, the very one whose leaky roof had been dripping water onto his neighbor's house. He'd come not out of gratitude, but because he'd felt ashamed. The 6 of them began digging. Groom couldn't dig himself. His body couldn't handle the strain. After 10 minutes with a shovel, his hands would start to shake. After 20, he couldn't lift them. That was his curse. The mind of an engineer trapped in a body that couldn't even hammer a nail. He stood next to the shaft and directed the work. He showed them how wide to dig. He explained why the walls had to be vertical rather than slanted. When they had dug a meter, he stopped the work. Now they needed shoring. Without reinforcing the walls, the shaft would collapse and bury whoever was down below. He found a solution in the forest: willow rods. Flexible and sturdy. They could be woven into cylindrical rings and lowered into the shaft, one on top of the other. Each ring held the walls in place and prevented the soil from crumbling inward. He showed Shake how to weave. She mastered it in an hour and began weaving so quickly that before Groom could blink, she had finished her first ring. Her hands were made for this work. Strong fingers, precise movements. She didn't know the word craft, but she was a natural artisan. On the second day of digging, the chief arrived. Groom should have expected this sooner. The chief of the Cracked Stone tribe was named Durgan Big Fist, and the name didn't lie. His fists were the size of Groom's head. He stood 2 meters 40 tall. The scars on his face and body were like a map of the battles he'd fought. One eye was milky white, blind. He'd lost it in a skirmish 20 years ago. Durgan stood over the pit and looked down. There, Crag and Bernie were shoveling dirt up. Willow rings held the walls in place. The pit was already 1.5 meters deep. Durgan asked what it was. Groom answered. The chief looked at him with his one good eye. For a long time. Then he said that if the blacksmith's son was looking for water, let him look. But if there was no water in 3 days, then Groom had dug a grave. And he would lie in it himself. For wasting the warrior's time on nonsense. He walked away. Targ turned pale. Even his green skin had turned pale gray. Bernie stopped digging. Groom stood over the pit and thought. 3 days, 4 to 5 meters deep. The soil was getting denser with every meter. At their current pace, they were barely keeping up. If there was no water at the estimated depth, he wouldn't have time to dig any deeper. And the chieftain wasn't joking. Orcs don't joke about things like this. He looked at his team. 5 pairs of eyes were staring at him, waiting. He'd said there would be water. He'd told them to dig. They dug. The third day, 3 meters. The soil had changed. It had grown darker, moister. Groom climbed down into the shaft himself. His legs trembled with fear, not fear of the depth, but fear of making a mistake. He scooped up a handful of dirt from the bottom. He squeezed it. Moisture seeped out between his fingers. The aquifer was close. He climbed out and told them to dig faster. The 4th day, dawn, 4 meters 20. Crag struck with his shovel and froze. There was a sloshing sound from below. He shouted something from below in Orcish, which Groom interpreted as a very emotional confirmation that there was water. The water rose slowly, Murky at first, but it was there. Groom stood over the well and watched as the level rose. 1 centimeter, 2, 5, 10. It stopped 30 centimeters from the bottom. That was enough. They had to let it settle. In a day, the water would be clear. He sat down on the edge and covered his face with his hands. Not out of joy, out of exhaustion. 4 days without proper sleep. 4 days in constant fear that the calculation would turn out to be wrong. 4 days waiting for the huge, one-eyed chieftain to keep his promise. Targ slapped him on the back. He nearly knocked him into the well. Bernie smiled. For the first time. Shaka silently continued weaving rings for the upper casing. By noon, Hrogar arrived. He brought a bucket. A real iron bucket that had cost a fortune in a tribe where metal was valued more than life itself. He tied it to a rope and lowered it into the well. He pulled it back up. The water was still murky but no longer dirty. Hrogar looked at the water. Then he raised the bucket to his lips and drank. For a long time. Thirstily. When he pulled away from the bucket, there was an expression on his face that Groom couldn't describe. Surprise. Or bewilderment. He said the water was different, that it didn't smell like a stream, that it was clean. Groom nodded. Well water is filtered through layers of soil. It's cleaner than any surface water. He didn't bother explaining the filtration process. He simply said that the earth purifies the water as it passes through the rocks. Hrogar stood there with the bucket, silent. Then he turned toward the smithy. Then back to the well. For the first time in his life, he drank water that didn't taste of mud and rot. By evening, there was a line at the well. The whole settlement. 237 orcs. Everyone wanted to try it. Groom made a wooden pulley to lift the bucket. A simple mechanism. A handle and a shaft with a rope. The first mechanism in the settlement. The orcs turned the handle and laughed. They didn't understand how it worked. To them, it was magic. The bucket rose of its own accord from the depths. Durgan came that evening. He stood off to the side. He watched. His face betrayed no emotion. Then he approached Groom. Silently. He placed his enormous hand on Groom's shoulder. He squeezed. It didn't hurt, but Groom felt the weight of that hand. Then he left. It was the closest thing to an apology the orc chieftain was capable of. That night, Groom sat alone by the well. Targ and Bernie had fallen asleep. Shaka had gone home. Nahi was waiting for him in the hut. He sat and thought. The well solved the water problem, but the food problem remained. Groom built the storage shed from whatever was available, and there wasn't much. Stones from the riverbed, clay from the bank, logs he'd managed to barter for from the forest crew in exchange for a promise to repair their hut. He chose a spot next to the well. Logistics. Water and food had to be in the center of the settlement so that no one would waste unnecessary energy carrying them. The warehouse was a simple structure, but revolutionary for this world. A stone foundation made of river stones laid with mortar between the joints. Walls made of adobe blocks, not just lumps of clay, but blocks of uniform size, air-dried. Groom made a wooden mold, just one, and he showed Tarog how to fill it with clay mixed with straw and tamp it down. Adobe, the most primitive building material in human history. They didn't know it here. Tarog made the first brick and examined it for a long time. Smooth edges, uniform size. He asked why all the bricks had to be the same. Groom replied, identical blocks fit together evenly. A level wall stands straight. A straight wall distributes the load evenly. An even load doesn't break the wall. Targ was silent for a long time. Then he said that it was like the formation of warriors in battle. If everyone stands evenly, shield to shield, the formation cannot be broken through. But if someone sticks out or falls behind, the enemy will strike through that gap. Groom looked at him and for the first time truly smiled in this world. He said that was exactly right. Targ understood engineering through the lens of war. It was unconventional, but it worked. It took 10 days to build the warehouse. Walls. A roof made of logs covered with a layer of clay and dry grass for insulation. A door made of 2 planks fastened together with a crossbar. Ventilation holes under the roof. Small ones, about the size of a fist. 4 of them. 1 on each side. They ensured air circulation inside the storage shed. The meat wouldn't rot from moisture. The floor was raised above the ground on stone pillars. There was a gap between the floor and the ground about the width of a palm. Air flows in from below and dries the planks. Rats and mice cannot climb the smooth stones. Every detail had a purpose. Every purpose had an engineering explanation. The orcs didn't understand the explanations, but they saw the result. When the first pieces of dried meat were moved to the storage room and arranged on the wooden shelves that Groom had designed on 3 levels, storage capacity tripled. Before, the meat had lain in a heap on the ground. Now it hung and lay on the shelves, dry, well ventilated, protected from snow, moisture, and rodents. The women stood at the entrance and watched. One of them, Gala, whose children had stopped coughing, said that now the food wouldn't go to waste. Groom nodded. Every piece of meat that doesn't rot means one more day of life for one of the 48 children. Alongside the storage shed, Groom worked on traps. He wasn't a hunter, but he was an engineer. And a trap is a mechanism, a simple mechanism with a single purpose: to force the prey into a structure from which it cannot escape. He designed 3 types: snare traps for small game, hares, foxes, and anything else that runs along the trails. The principle is simple: a snare made of sinew tied to a bent twig. The twig is held in place by a peg with a trigger. The animal sets off the trigger, and the twig straightens, pulling the snare up along with the prey. Pit traps for large game. A pit as deep as an orc's height, covered with branches and snow. Sharpened stakes at the bottom. Cruel but effective. Drive fences. Long fences made of branches and brush that guide the herd toward the pit traps. They don't catch the prey themselves. They guide it. He explained this to the hunters. They listened with expressions that wavered between bewilderment and offense. Orcs hunted with spears. They tracked. They drove the prey. They killed. It was a matter of honor. Traps were something dishonorable, despicable, unworthy of a warrior. Groom had expected this. He didn't argue about honor. He asked how many days ago the last hunting party had returned with game. Silence. 4 days. He asked how much meat was left in the drying racks. Silence. Enough for 10 days. He asked what the children would eat in 10 days. Silence. He said that traps are no substitute for hunting. Traps work while the hunters rest. 20 traps work 24 hours a day. No hunter can work 24 hours. This isn't a matter of honor. It's arithmetic. An old hunter named Gormak spat on the ground and walked away. The other 3 exchanged glances and walked away as well. 2 remained. Young men. Hungry. With young wives and small children. They said they would show Groom the animal trails. That was enough. In 3 days, they set 12 snare traps along the hare trails north of the settlement, 2 pit traps on the deer trail leading to the watering hole, and 1 dry fence 100 paces long. On the first morning, there were 3 hares in the snares. On the second, 5. On the third morning, a deer was caught in a pit trap. A young male. 60 kilograms of meat. When the carcass was brought to the settlement, Gormak stood at the entrance and watched. His face was stony. Then he approached Groom and said that setting traps wasn't hunting. But meat is meat. And if the blacksmith's frail son can make it so that meat comes to him on its own, then let him do it. It wasn't approval. It was a surrender to reality. Groom accepted it in silence. Insulating the huts became the third project. He started with his own. He demonstrated the principle. A double wall. The inner wall remains as is. On the outside, at a distance of a palm's width, a second wall is erected from woven shields coated with clay. The space between the walls is filled with dry grass or pine needles. An air gap and plant-based insulation, primitive but effective thermal insulation. Heat loss is reduced by Urzel struck at dawn, not with his fist, with his words. He convened a council of elders, 5 old men and Chief Durgan. They sat in the chieftain's hut around the fire, and Urzel spoke. Groom was not present. Targ, who had been eavesdropping by the wall, told him what was said. Urzel said that the spirits were angry, that the young blacksmith was violating ancient laws, that water must flow freely because it is the blood of the earth, and whoever locks the blood of the earth within a stone wall brings a curse upon the tribe, that walls must not be double, because the spirits of winter must touch the sleepers to take away the weak. It had always been so. The weak die, the strong live. That is the law of Father Boar. Groom listened to Targ's account and said nothing. He wasn't surprised. He had been expecting this ever since the day Urzel first saw his blueprint for the drainage system. The question wasn't whether Urzel would strike, but when and how. Now he knew. Targ said the elders had remained silent, that Durgan had remained silent, that Urzel had demanded a trial by fire, an ancient ritual. The accused walks through a bonfire. If the spirits protect him, he is innocent. If he burns, it means he was tainted. Groom stood there, staring at his slender green hands. A trial by fire. Literally, to walk through a bonfire. In the body of a 14-year-old boy who could barely lift a shovel. Targ was pale gray. Bernie clenched his fists. Shaka silently sharpened her knife. Groom asked when. Targ replied, "At sunset." He had half a day. He went to see Hrogar. His father was standing by the anvil, not forging. Just standing there. His hammer lay on the ground. It was the first time Groom had ever seen Hrogar's hammer on the ground. His father knew. Groom asked directly, could his father protect him? Hrogar was silent. Then he replied that he could not go against the shaman, that the shaman speaks with the spirits. If Hrogar stood up for his son against Ursula, the tribe might banish them both. And banishment in winter meant death. For everyone. For Nahi, too. Groom nodded. He wasn't angry with his father. Hrogar was a product of his world. A world where the shaman stood between the living and the dead, and no one dared to challenge him. Groom left the smithy and walked toward the sanctuary. Rika was inside. In the smoke. With red eyes. She saw his face and understood. She said she knew. That his father had made up his mind. That she'd tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. Groom asked how the trial by fire worked. Rika explained. A bonfire 10 paces long. The flames reach waist high. The candidate walks through it from one end to the other. If they make it through alive and without severe burns, the spirits have accepted them. Groom listened and thought. 10 paces. That's about 7 meters. The flames reach waist high. That means the bulk of the fire is less than a meter high. It takes 5 to 6 seconds to cross at a brisk pace. If running, 3 to 4 seconds. Third-degree burns occur with contact with the flames lasting longer than 5 seconds. With contact lasting less than 3 seconds, first- or second-degree burns result. Painful but not fatal. If you wet your clothes and skin. If you cover your face with a wet cloth. If you run. He asked Rika if there were any rules. Is it allowed to run? She replied that there were no rules. Just go from start to finish. Don't take a detour. Don't stop. He asked if he could wet his body before going through. She frowned. She said there were no such rules because no one had ever asked about it. Groom almost smiled. Of course no one had asked. Because no one thought of fire as a problem with parameters. Temperature, duration of exposure, burn area, heat protection. Everyone thought of fire as the will of the spirits, but he thought of fire as an engineering problem. He left the sanctuary. There were 4 hours left until sunset. He spent them by the well. First, he asked Bernie to bring a goat skin, the thickest one. He soaked it in water from the well. Then he wrung it out and soaked it again. The skin became thoroughly saturated. The wet skin lost its flammability. Water evaporates at 100 degrees. As long as the water is evaporating, the hide remains at 100 degrees. It's painful but not fatal. He'll suffer burns, but he'll survive if he acts fast. He asked Shock to cut the hide into strips. He wrapped them around his legs from his feet to his knees. The wet strips clung to his skin. His legs would be right in the flames. They needed maximum protection. He wrapped his body and arms in a wide piece of wet cloth. He covered his face with a strip of wet hide with slits for his eyes. He probably looked like a wet green cocoon. He didn't care. At sunset, the entire tribe gathered in the square by the totem pole. 237 orcs stood in a semicircle. A bonfire burned in the center, a long one 10 paces across. The flames rose to the waist of an adult orc, to Groom's chest. The heat could be felt from 10 meters away. Urzel stood by the fire in full shamanic regalia, bones, feathers, and face paint. He spoke the words of the ritual, summoning the spirits to judge. His voice was steady and confident. He had no doubt about the outcome. The frail boy would burn. The spirits would punish the heretic. Order would be restored. Groom stood on the other side of the fire, wet, wrapped in cloth. His team stood behind him. Targ, his mouth agape. Bernie, his face stony. Shaka, a knife in her hand and an expression that said if Groom didn't emerge from the other side, she would go for Urzel. Nahi. Little Nahi stood next to Bernie, holding his hand. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were huge and unblinking. Groom looked at her. He had promised that the roof wouldn't collapse. He had promised, and he had kept his word. Now he had to keep a promise he hadn't made out loud. Not to die. Urzel finished the ritual. He turned to Groom. His yellow eyes slid over the wet bandages. For the first time, something flashed across his face. Not fear, confusion. He hadn't expected the sacrifice to come prepared. Groom didn't wait for an invitation. He took a deep breath, held it, and ran. The first 3 steps were bearable. Heat struck from below. The wet bandages on his legs sizzled. Steam rose from his skin. The 4th step. Pain. Real pain. His legs were burning. Not from the fire, beneath the bandages. The water was evaporating and his skin was beginning to heat up. The 5th step. He could no longer feel his feet. The 6th. The 7th. He could see the end of the bonfire. 3 steps. 2. 1. He flew out of the fire and fell into the snow. He rolled. Steam rose from his entire body. The bandages were smoldering. The skin on his left shin was burned, 2nd degree. Blisters would form. His right hand, 1st degree, red, swollen. His face, unscathed. The wet hide had saved him. He lay in the snow, breathing. Every breath felt like a hammer blow to his ribs. But he was breathing. A gray sky loomed above him. Then Nahi's face appeared above him. She was looking at him, and her lower lip was trembling. He told her everything was fine. She didn't believe him, but she smiled. That same evening, Hrogar's hut. Groom lay on his straw mat. Rika came uninvited. She brought an herbal ointment. Silently, she treated the burns. Her hands were cool and gentle. He asked what her father had said. She replied that her father was silent, that he hadn't expected this, that according to the law, Groom had passed the trial and the spirits had accepted him, that Urzel couldn't issue a second challenge right away. He needed a reason, a new reason. Groom nodded. A respite. Not a victory, a respite. He asked Rika why she was helping him. She was silent for a long time. Then she replied that when she sat in the smoke in the sanctuary and her eyes burned and she coughed so hard she couldn't read the signs of the fire, she thought that maybe the spirits wanted her to see the flame clearly, that maybe Groom wasn't the spirit's enemy, that maybe he was the one building a path for the spirits upward. She said this quietly, almost in a whisper, as if she were afraid the walls would hear. Then she left as silently as she had come. Groom lay there, staring at the ceiling. The burns throbbed. The ointment helped, but the pain was still there. He wasn't thinking about the pain. He was thinking about what had happened. Urzel had lost this round. But a shaman isn't the type to give up. The next strike would be smarter, more subtle. Perhaps not aimed at him, but at those who supported him. At Hrogar, at Nahi, at his command. He needed to pick up the pace. Every day he spent on minor repairs was a day Urzel spent preparing his next strike. He needed a project that would change everything. Not the repair of a single hut. Not a well. Not a storage shed. Something that would show the entire tribe at once that his path led to life. He closed his eyes and began to count in his head. In a week, the stream would freeze over completely. The well was working, but there was barely enough water. The traps provided meat, but there still wasn't enough for 237 mouths to feed. Firewood was running out. The forest was an hour's walk away. Every trip for firewood took a whole day for 4 orcs, a day that could have been spent building or hunting. Transportation. That was the key word. The orcs carried everything on their backs. Logs, stones, meat, and water to the well. Every kilogram per meter consumed strength they already lacked. They needed a cart, a wheel. He could have built a wheel, but a wheel required a level surface. And all around was snow and mud and a frozen steppe full of bumps. A wheel would sink into the very first ditch. Not a wheel, skids, a sled. Two runners made of bent wood, held together by a frame. He could pull it with a rope. A single orc drags a sled, carrying a load 4 times heavier than what he could carry on his back. Across the snow, across the icy crust, across the frozen ground. He sat down. The burns howled with the movement. He gritted his teeth and began to draw on the floor with a stick. The runners must be made of birch. Birch bends when heated over steam. The representatives are 2 meters long. The width between them is 1 meter. The frame consists of crossbars, 3 of them, tied together with ropes, then secured with leather straps. The front crossbar should be rounded and bent upward so the sled doesn't get stuck with its nose in the snow. The total weight of the structure is about 30 kilograms. The load capacity is up to 200. In the morning, he called for Hrogar. He showed him the sketch. He explained. Hrogar looked at the sketch, then at Groom, then at his own hands. He said he could bend the wood, that he needed fire and water. Groom nodded. Exactly. Steam softens the wood fibers. The wood bends. It cools in its new shape and retains it. Hrogar went to the smithy. 2 days later, he brought back 2 runners. Straight, smooth, curved at the ends. He'd made them with a precision Groom hadn't expected. The blacksmith's hands. Hands that had worked with metal and wood all his life. The only thing missing was a blueprint. Now there was a blueprint. The sled was ready in 3 days. The second month began with a dead man. An old man named Varg died during the night in his hut. Not from the cold. Not from hunger. From the cough that had tormented him since fall and had finally reached his lungs. Groom stood by the body and looked. Varg lay curled up on the earthen floor. His hut was one of those that Groom hadn't had time to insulate. The north wall. Cracks wide enough for a finger. A damp floor. Mold in the corners. Groom could have saved him if he'd reached this hut a week earlier. But a week ago, he'd been caught in a fire and was lying there with burns. A week stolen by Urzel with his trial. A week that cost Varg his life. Groom stood there and felt anger rising from his stomach to his throat. Not at Urzel, at himself. At the fact that he'd wasted time on politics instead of work. At the fact that he'd let the shaman distract him from what really mattered. He swore it would never happen again. He insulated Varg's hut in 2 days. Then he moved a family from the worst ramshackle shack in the settlement into it. A young mother with 3 children. She stood in the doorway, unable to enter. She couldn't believe it. Groom picked up the youngest child and carried him inside. He set the child down on the dry floor by the stove. The child laughed. The mother followed him inside. For the next 3 weeks, Groom worked like a man possessed. The remaining 21 huts. Each one had to be inspected. A plan had to be drawn up. Work had to be assigned. Materials, people, deadlines. He kept track of everything in his head and recorded it with sticks on clay tablets. Targ became his right-hand man. The boy turned out to be gifted, not with his hands, but with his mind. He remembered everything the first time. Groom would recite a list of 20 items to him, and Targ would repeat it an hour later without a single mistake. He began to understand the logic, not just what to do, but why. When Groom said that the drainage ditch needed to be dug with a slope of 2 fingers for every 10 steps, Targ asked why exactly 2 fingers. Groom explained, any less, and the water will pool. Any more, and the ditch would wash itself away. Targ nodded, and from that moment on, he checked the slope of every ditch himself. Bernie was the opposite. He didn't ask questions, he just did. His body was a tool that never got tired. He could haul rocks from dawn till dusk and still ask for more work. Groom quickly realized that Bernie was his crane, his excavator, his bulldozer all rolled into one. Shaka found her calling in weaving. Willow rings for the well. Woven shields for insulation. Baskets for carrying stones. Her hands created things that hadn't existed before her, and each was stronger than it had any right to be. Groom called them the brigade. The word had no translation in Orochi. He used a word that roughly meant hunting pack. But they weren't hunting. They were building. By the middle of the second month, 4 more had joined the brigade. 2 teenagers and 2 adults. Crag was already there. His wife, Tuna, arrived. a quiet, reserved orc woman who turned out to be the best stonemason in the settlement. Her hands had a feel for stone. She could look at two stones and tell which one would fit more smoothly. Groom didn't know how she did it, but she did, and he didn't argue. A young warrior named Rog arrived. He was enormous, even by orc standards. 2 meters 60, arms like logs. He came because Groom had repaired his mother's hut without asking for anything in return. Rog didn't say thank you. Orcs don't say thank you. He simply showed up in the morning, stood next to Bernie, and waited to be told what to do. With 2 orcs like that, Groom could move stones that had previously been impossible to lift. Construction picked up speed. By the end of the second month, all 41 huts had been insulated. All the chimneys were working properly. The drainage system covered 3/4 of the settlement. The well was providing water. The storage shed was 1/3 full. The traps were working reliably. 5 to 7 hares a day. A deer once every 4 days. It wasn't enough for 237 mouths to feed, but it was better than nothing. Groom began to think about the next step, a kiln. Everything he had built so far was made of mud bricks, unfired clay mixed with straw. It worked. But the unfired bricks would get soggy in the rain. They'd crack in the cold. They'd crumble on impact. Fired bricks were 10 times stronger, 10 times more durable. With them, he could build walls that would last not just 2 seasons, but 20 years. The problem was the temperature. Firing bricks required about 1,000 degrees. A regular bonfire reached 500 to 600. Krogar's blacksmith's forge with hand-operated bellows reached 800 to 900. A special kiln was needed, a sealed chamber with a regulated air supply. More air meant more oxygen. More oxygen meant a higher temperature. A controlled flow of air through narrowing channels accelerated it, using the same principle as the chimney in the sanctuary. He drew a sketch. A dome-shaped kiln, a loading chamber at the bottom, a firebox on the side, air ducts with dampers, a chimney at the top. Bricks were loaded into the chamber. The firebox burned for 2 days. The temperature rose slowly. If heated too quickly, the bricks would crack from thermal shock. Slow, even heating up to 1,000 degrees. Then slow cooling for another 2 days. The result was a sturdy reddish-brown brick that could be thrown against a wall without breaking. Krogar studied the blueprint for a long time. His fingers traced the lines. He said he understood the principle that a forge works the same way, only on a smaller scale. Groom nodded. Exactly. Scaling. Take what works on a small scale and make it bigger. They spent 2 weeks building the kiln. Krogar made metal dampers for the air ducts. Tuna laid the stones with a precision that amazed Groom. Bernie and Rog hauled clay and stones. Targ kept track of the materials. Shaka wove baskets for carrying the raw bricks. Groom stood in the center and directed the work. His voice was hoarse from constantly giving orders. His legs ached from constantly walking between the different sections. His burns hadn't fully healed yet and throbbed with pain every evening. But the kiln was growing, day by day, brick by brick. The first firing was a big event. Groom loaded 40 unfired bricks into the kiln chamber. He closed the loading chute. He lit the firebox, and he began to wait. For 2 days, he didn't leave the kiln. He adjusted the dampers. He added firewood. He watched the color of the flame. He watched the color of the smoke. White smoke meant that moisture was evaporating from the bricks. When the smoke turned clear, the moisture was gone and the actual firing began. He opened the air vents wider. The temperature rose. The kiln walls glowed red hot. On the second day, he closed all the dampers and let the kiln cool down. 2 more days. The longest of his life in this world. When he finally opened the chamber, 36 bricks lay inside. Reddish-brown. Ringing when struck against one another. 4 were cracked. A 10% defect rate. For a first firing, it was an excellent result. He picked up a brick and went out into the square. He threw it onto the stones. The brick didn't break. He picked it up and threw it again. Harder. A corner chipped off. But the brick remained intact. The orcs stood around watching. Krogar picked up the brick. He clenched it in his hands. His fingers turned white from the strain. The brick wouldn't give way. Krogar looked at his son. Something had changed in his eyes. It wasn't pride. It was more than that. Understanding. He was beginning to understand that his frail son saw the world differently, that his drawings with a stick in the mud were not a whim but a language spoken by stone and wood and fire, that this language was stronger than a hammer. Urzel saw the brick too. He stood off to the side. His face was inscrutable. But Groom noticed how his fingers clenched around his staff. His knuckles turned white. The shaman saw a threat, not in the brick itself, but in what the brick signified. If the boy could turn mud into stone, what else could he turn into? And if the spirits hadn't stopped him in the fire, then perhaps the spirits were on his side. And if the spirits were on Groom's side, then whose side was Urzel on? That thought was more terrifying to the shaman than any flame. Toward the end of the second month, strangers arrived. Not enemies. Worse. Refugees. 17 orcs from the Broken Horn tribe, women, children, 3 old men, 1 wounded warrior with a hack wound on his thigh that had been festering for a week. Their tribe had been wiped out by the Bloodaxe clan. They slaughtered everyone who could wield a weapon. The rest were driven out into the steppe to die. They had walked for 4 days through the snow. 2 children died along the way. They couldn't bury them. They simply left them in the snow. They reached the settlement of Cracked Stone because they had heard there was water and walls here. Durgan stood at the gate and looked at them. His face was stony. 17 extra mouths to feed. 17 bodies that needed to be fed and kept warm. Supplies were already scarce. The logic was simple: drive them away, or take them in and condemn his own people to starvation. Urzel stood nearby. He said that the spirits had sent these orcs as a test, that a strong clan does not take in weak outsiders, that the law of blood and fang is clear. The elders nodded. Groom stood aside and did the math. 17 mouths to feed. 3 weeks' worth of supplies for his own people. If divided among 17 more, the supplies would be reduced to 2.5 weeks, a difference of a day and a half. A day and a half versus 17 lives. He stepped forward. Everyone turned to look. The frail son of the blacksmith, who had built walls and walked through fire, stood before the chieftain and the shaman. He said he would take them in. Not the tribe. He, personally, that he would build their hut himself, that they would work on his crew, that every extra mouth to feed meant 2 more hands, that 2 of these women looked strong enough to haul stones, that the old men could weave baskets and tend the traps, that the children could gather firewood. He didn't ask for permission. He presented them with a fait accompli. Durgan looked at him, with one eye. A long, heavy gaze that sent a chill through Groom's insides. Then the chieftain looked at the refugees. At the woman standing at the front with a dead expression on her face and a child in her arms. At the wounded warrior who was staying on his feet only because 2 girls were propping him up on either side. At the old men who stood silently with empty eyes, waiting to be sent out to die on the steppe. Durgan said one word. Let them. And he left. Urzel remained. His eyes burned with rage. But he said nothing, because the chieftain had decided. And not even the shaman would openly defy the chieftain. Groom settled the refugees in a temporary shelter. A large tent made of animal hides stretched over a frame of poles. Inside was a hearth. The floor was insulated with gravel and clay. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a roof and was warm. He washed the wounded man's wound with boiled water. Not out of medical knowledge, but out of common sense. Pus is an infection. An infection is filth. Clean, hot water kills filth. He bandaged the wound with clean cloth and changed the bandage every day. After a week, the pus stopped. After 2 weeks, the warrior was back on his feet. His name was Garak, short for an orc. 1.90 meters, lean and sinewy, with scars all over his body. He stood before Groom and said nothing. Then he said that his life belonged to Groom, not an oath of loyalty, a fact. Groom replied that he didn't need someone else's life. He needed hands that knew how to work. Garak nodded and went off to haul stones. The refugees joined the work crew within 3 days. The women worked furiously, not out of gratitude, but out of fear. Fear that they'd be driven out if they proved useless. Groom saw that fear and hated it. But he used it, because the alternative was to let them sit idly by and watch as they withered away from shame and hopelessness. Work gave them a purpose. Purpose gave them strength. By the end of the week, one of the women from Broken Horn, named Farney, had turned out to be the best builder Groom had ever met in this world. She understood stone. Not like Tuna, who felt it with her hands. Farney saw the entire wall. She saw how the stones had to fit together for the wall to be level. She could spot a mistake in the masonry from 10 paces away. Groom put her in charge of teaching the others. For the first time, he had not one master but two. An assembly line, a flow, a system. One crew dug the foundations, another laid the stones. A third mixed the mortar. A fourth shaped the bricks and loaded the kiln. Groom stood in the center and coordinated. His voice was thin and weak by orc standards, but they listened to him. Because every word he spoke turned into a wall that stood firm, into a roof that didn't leak, into a furnace that gave off heat, into a well that provided clean water. The authority of strength was replaced by the authority of results. Slowly, painfully slowly, but it was being replaced. In the middle of the third month, Groom began the project he feared most of all. A stone wall around the settlement. Not a palisade of rotten logs. A wall, made of fired bricks set with lime mortar. 2 meters high, half a meter thick, with corner towers for surveillance. He knew it was madness. He didn't have enough people. He didn't have enough bricks. He didn't have enough time. Winter was in full swing. The ground was frozen solid. Digging a foundation in frozen ground is back-breaking work. But he had no choice. Because the Bloodaxe clan, which had wiped out the Broken Horn tribe, was just 3 days' journey away. And if they found out that the refugees had found shelter in cracked stone, they would come. Not out of revenge, out of principle. An enemy left unvanquished is a future threat. And Cracked Rock, with its 40 huts and flimsy palisade, was easy prey. Groom calculated the perimeter. 320 meters. Number of bricks? 160,000. Amount of mortar? 20 metric tons. Man-hours? 40,000. He had 18 able-bodied builders and 3 months until spring, when raids would become possible. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how he looked at it. He pored over the calculations for 3 nights. Nahi brought him water and pieces of meat. She didn't ask what he was doing. She just sat nearby and waited. On the 4th night, he found a solution. Not a wall around the entire perimeter. That was impossible in 3 months. 3 sections of wall at key points. The north side, where the attack would come from. The west side, where the ravine creates a dead zone. And the gate. The remaining sections would be covered by a reinforced palisade of double logs with a fill of stones and earth between them. Not ideal, but enough to slow down the attackers and give the defenders time to take up their positions. He showed the plan to Durgan. The chieftain looked at the drawing and said nothing. Then he asked why they needed a wall. Groom answered directly. The bloody axe will come. Not today, not tomorrow, but it will come. And when he comes, a palisade won't stop them for even a minute. Durgan was a warrior. He understood war better than Groom. He looked at the drawing again. Then he said he would give Groom 30 warriors. For 2 months. If the wall wasn't finished by the beginning of the 3rd month, he would take the men back. 30 warriors. Plus 18 builders. 48 workers. That changed the equation. Groom did the math in his head. 3 sections of wall, total length 110 meters. 12,000 bricks. 4 metric tons of mortar. 8,000 man-hours. 48 workers at 10 hours a day equals 480 man-hours a day. 17 days of pure work. Allowing for delays due to weather and materials, about 30. A month. It was possible. Just barely, but possible. He started the next morning. They built the wall in the freezing cold. They had to warm up the ground with bonfires before digging the trench for the foundation. Groom divided the work into 3 shifts. The first shift tended the fires along the line of the future foundation. The second shift dug the thawed soil. The third shift laid the bricks in the trench. By that time, the first shift was already lighting fires at the next section. An assembly line. A continuous flow. There weren't enough bricks. The kiln produced 36 bricks per firing cycle. Each cycle took 4 days. 9 bricks a day. He needed 400 a day to meet the deadline. He built a second kiln, 3 times larger than the first. It could hold 120 bricks per cycle, 30 a day. Still not enough. He built a third, and a fourth. The 4 kilns ran around the clock. Someone stood watch at each one all night long, keeping the fire going, adjusting the dampers. Firewood was being consumed at an alarming rate. The sleds worked non-stop. 3 pairs of sleds, 6 trips a day to the forest and back. Groom had to organize the logging. A crew of 5 orcs cut down trees. Another crew sawed them into logs of the right size. A third loaded them onto the sleds. A fourth unloaded them at the kilns. Every orc knew his task. Each did one thing and did it well. Specialization. Division of labor. The foundation of the Industrial Revolution, which this world had never known and would not know for another 1,000 years, unless Groom sped up the process. On the 10th day of construction, Kargash arrived. The older brother stood by the trench and watched as the orcs laid stones in the foundation. His face was expressionless. Then he approached Groom and said he wanted to help. Groom looked at him. Kargash didn't look him in the eye. He looked away. At the wall, at the stones, at anything but his younger brother's face. Groom understood. This wasn't reconciliation. Kargash had heard about the blood axe. Kargash was a warrior. He understood what a raid meant. He understood that a stockade wouldn't save them, and he understood that the only one who could build something capable of saving them was this frail younger brother whom he had despised his whole life. Groom handed him a shovel. Kargash dug, silently, furiously. He alone did as much work as 3 ordinary diggers. His anger at his brother turned into anger at the frozen ground, and the ground was losing. By evening, he had dug a section of trench 20 paces long, a construction record. Groom approached him as he was finishing. Kargash was covered in mud and sweat. His breath came out in puffs of steam. Groom said that tomorrow morning, Kargash would lead the 2nd Brigade of Diggers. Kargash looked at him, for the first time ever, straight into his eyes. Then he nodded, a single movement, and he walked away. Rika came at night, not to him, to the wall. She stood and watched the masonry take shape. Once, Groom caught her touching a brick, stroking it with her fingers.
He asked what she was doing.
She replied that she could feel the warmth, not the physical heat from the kiln, something else. She said that in every stone there is a part of the fire with which it was created. That fire is spirit, and that the wall is full of spirits that will protect the tribe. Groom remained silent. He didn't believe in spirits, but he believed that faith gives strength. If Rika saw the protection of spirits in the wall, then the wall became stronger. Not physically, psychologically. Defenders who believe the wall is sacred will stand behind it to the very end. He asked if she could perform the ritual, consecrate the wall, make it a place of power for the tribe. Rika looked at him. In the moonlight, her eyes were dark gold. She said that this was a ritual that must be performed by a shaman, not an apprentice. If she performed it without her father's permission, it would be a violation. He said he understood. She stood there for another minute. Then she said she would think about it, and she walked off into the darkness. On the 20th day, the first section of the wall was ready, the northern section, 40 meters long, 2 meters high, half a meter thick. 2 corner towers, 3 meters high. The towers were simple, stone platforms with a low parapet, but from them, one could see the entire northern horizon to a distance of 2 arrow flights. Groom stationed lookouts on the towers. For the first time in the tribe's history, someone was looking beyond the horizon, not in search of game, but in anticipation of the enemy. Systematically, on a schedule, day and night. Durgan came to inspect the wall. He walked along it, touching the bricks. He pushed against it with his shoulder. The wall didn't budge. He climbed up to the tower. He stood there for a long time looking north. Then he climbed down and walked over to Groom. He said that in 40 years he had seen many walls, palisades, stone fences, earthen ramparts. None of them looked like this. He asked if the wall could withstand a battering ram. Groom replied that it could. He explained that the wall's thickness and the lime mortar masonry created a structure that absorbed the impact with its entire mass, rather than with a single brick. That to breach such a wall, they'd need a battering ram weighing at least a metric ton and 20 orcs who would strike the same spot for an hour. During that hour, the defenders in the towers would pelt them with stones. Durgan was silent. Then he said that Groom needed 20 more warriors. Groom felt his breath catch in his throat. 50 warriors on the construction site. That was more than he'd asked for, more than he'd hoped for. The chieftain was beginning to believe. The western section and the gates took another 20 days. The gates were Groom's pride and joy. Double gates. The outer gates were made of heavy oak planks on iron hinges forged by Hrogar. The inner gates were made of fired brick. Between them was a space 2 paces wide. If an enemy broke through the outer gates, they would find themselves in a narrow corridor between the 2 walls. Above was a platform with a parapet. Defenders would throw stones and pour boiling water from there. A classic element of castle architecture, the gatehouse. He remembered it from his textbook on the history of fortifications, 3rd year, the module on medieval military architecture. He'd received the highest grade for it. Hrogar had spent 2 days forging the gate hinges. He had poured all his skill into them.
The hinges were massive and smooth,
And the gate moved on them with a quiet creak rather than a clang. When the gate closed for the first time and the heavy bolt settled into the stone grooves, Hrogar stood and watched it. Then he looked at Groom, and for the first time in this body's life, Groom saw something on his father's face that made his throat tighten. Hrogar placed a hand on his shoulder. Not heavily, like Durgan. Lightly, gently, as if afraid of breaking him. He said nothing. He just stood there, a hand on his son's shoulder, the 2 of them by the closed gates. Then he removed his hand and went into the smithy. The rest of the perimeter was secured with a reinforced palisade, double logs with earth fill. Not a wall, but 3 times stronger than the old palisade. Enough to hold off the attackers for a few minutes. Those minutes would be enough to redeploy the defenders from the stone walls to the threatened section. Groom stood on the northern tower and looked at his work. The wall, the gates, the towers, the palisade. It was ugly by the standards of his former world. Uneven masonry, rough mortar, crooked corners. No inspection would have approved this. But it worked. Every stone was where it should be. Every joint held up under the load. Every tower provided a clear view. Below, people were walking among the huts. His people. 254 of them, along with the refugees. The well provided water. The storeroom held food. The traps caught game. The kilns were firing bricks. The wall stood. He closed his eyes and for a second allowed himself to feel something resembling peace. They arrived 6 days after the wall was finished. Groom was standing on the northern tower when the lookout pointed toward the horizon. A black line on the white snow. Moving. Growing. The Bloodaxe clan was on the march. Groom counted. His eyes were poor for an orc. Weak. But he saw enough. About 150 warriors, maybe 200, against 61 combat-ready orcs in cracked stone, plus Garrock and 3 more from the refugees. 55 defenders, 1 against 3. Without the wall, it would have been a death sentence. With the wall, there was a chance. He climbed down from the tower and found Durgan. The chieftain already knew. An orc's hearing is better than a human's. He had heard the drums. Groom laid out the defense plan he had drawn up 2 weeks earlier. Durgan looked at him and, for the first time, listened not as a chieftain listens to a boy, but as a commander listens to an engineer. Groom explained. The bulk of the defenders would be on the northern wall. There was stone masonry there. There were towers there. That was where the enemy would attack first. 10 warriors on the western section, 5 at the gates, 10 in reserve in the center of the settlement. The reserve is under Kargash's command. Durgan raised an eyebrow. Kargash? Groom nodded. Kargash is fast and strong. He can redeploy the reserve to any section in a minute. Durgan thought it over and agreed. Next, traps. Groom set them up all along the northern flank. Not hunting snares. Combat traps. Pits with stakes, camouflaged by snow. Ropes stretched at shin level that would trip anyone running. A pile of rocks on the slope that could be brought crashing down with a single blow to the supporting rock. Primitive. But in the snow and in the heat of battle, even primitive traps were deadly. Stones on the walls. Groom had previously stockpiled head-sized stones on the towers and along the wall. 200 of them. Every stone thrown from the 2-meter wall at a running orc was like a blow from a hammer. Armor won't save you. Boiling water. 4 cauldrons on the wall. Water from the well. Fires burning beneath the cauldrons. When the enemy gets right up against the wall, boiling water will pour down from above. Groom led the women and children to the storeroom and to the 3 sturdiest huts in the center of the settlement. He put Nahi in the smithy, the sturdiest building of all, with walls a meter thick and an iron door that Hrogar had forged for his workshop. Nahi looked at him. She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to stay. She just looked at him. He told her he'd be back. She nodded, a small gesture, just like Hrogar, just like Durgan, just like all the orcs he knew. One gesture instead of 1,000 words. The Bloodaxe clan approached the settlement at dawn. Their chieftain rode ahead on a massive boar, a war boar, an animal the size of a bull, with tusks as long as a man's arm. The chieftain's name was Togrul the Crusher. Huge, even by orc standards. Nearly 3 meters tall, arms like tree trunks, armor made of boar bones and iron plates. Skulls hung from his belt. Not animals' skulls, orcs. He stopped 100 paces from the wall and watched, for a long time, in silence. He hadn't expected to see a wall. He had come to a flimsy settlement of rotten huts behind a palisade of sticks. But what he saw was a stone wall with towers and closed gates, and orcs on the wall looking down at him. For the first time in his life, someone was looking down on him. Togrul roared. He ordered the attack. 170 warriors of the Bloodaxe charged forward. The first 30 fell into traps. Pits opened up beneath their feet.
Stakes pierced their bodies.
Ropes tripped the runners. A pile of stones crashed down on the right flank, burying a dozen. Togrul lost 30 warriors before they even reached the wall. He roared again. The rest reached the northern wall. They began to scale it. The brickwork offered no foothold. Smooth. Even. Their fingers slipped off. Those accustomed to scaling a palisade by clinging to protruding logs could find no purchase on the wall of fired brick. Stones rained down from above. 200 stones the size of a head. Every single one hit its mark. The orcs below fell. With shattered skulls, with broken arms, with crushed ribs. The cauldrons tipped over. Boiling water gushed down the wall. The screams drowned out even the drums. Groom stood on the tower and watched. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. From horror. He saw creatures dying. Not on a blueprint. Not in a calculation. Real life. A stone struck a head, and the head split open. Boiling water scalded a face, and the orc howled and rolled across the snow. A pit of stakes pierced a body, and it twitched and fell silent. His traps, his stones, his wall, his killings. He felt sick. He doubled over and vomited right there on the tower. Targ stood nearby, his face pale. Bernie was down below, by the wall. He was hurling stones alongside the warriors. His face was calm. He was doing his job, as always. Togrul sent his men in for a second assault, with ladders, rough bundles of logs. 3 of them. They were leaned against the wall. The orcs began to climb. Durgan stood on the wall with an axe and chopped down the first one to appear at the top. Every blow was precise. Every blow sent a body tumbling down. Kargash led the reserves to the western wall when a group of 20 enemies tried to flank and strike there. They ran into a reinforced palisade, and Kargash, who stood in the breach and held it off single-handedly. His sword worked like a meat grinder. 3, 5, 7. They lay before him, and he stood there, splattered with blood, roaring, not out of rage but out of something greater. He was defending his home. For the first time in his life, he had a home worth defending. The battle lasted 2 hours. Then Togrul retreated. He had lost 57 warriors, killed and seriously wounded, more than a third of his force. Bodies lay against the wall on the white snow, and red stains spread out around them. The cracked stone lost 4. 4 out of 65, a casualty ratio of 14-1. Togrul stood 100 paces from the wall and watched. His boar snorted and stamped its hoof. His warriors stood behind him, battered, angry, confused. They had come to claim easy prey and had encountered something they had never seen before. A wall that couldn't be scaled. A defense that killed you before you even touched the enemy. Togrul turned his boar around and led his men away. He didn't say a word. He didn't swear to return. He didn't make threats. He just left. That was worse than any threat. It meant he would return. With greater force. With allies. With a battering ram. And next time, He'd be ready for the wall. Groom stood on the tower and watched as the black line receded beyond the horizon. Then he climbed down. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat down on the ground by the wall and leaned his back against the bricks. The bricks were warm. The fired clay retained heat even in winter. His bricks, his wall, his victory. 57 dead. 4 of his own. He sat there, breathing. Durgan found him an hour later. The chief stood over him, looking down. Then he crouched down. They were eye to eye. Durgan said that 30 years ago, Bloodaxe had come to Crackstone. Back then, they had 60 warriors. Crackstone had 90. Crackstone lost 50. Bloodaxe lost 20. Victory went to Bloodaxe. They took the livestock and 20 women. Today, Bloodaxe had 170. Crackstone had 65. Bloodaxe lost 57. Crackstone had 4. Durgan said he didn't understand this. That all his life, the one with more axes had won. That today, the one with the better wall had won. That the world had changed, and he wasn't sure he knew how to live in this new world. But he knew who knew. He stood up and held out his hand to Groom. The frail boy took the huge chieftain's hand and stood up. They stood by the wall that had saved the tribe, the chieftain and the builder, the old world and the new. Durgan said one word: build. After the battle, Groom didn't sleep for 3 nights. Not out of fear, out of work. He was compiling a list of what had gone wrong. 12 points. Blind spots to the south. Insufficient stone reserves in the western section. The boiling water cauldrons were too small. The reserve's response time was too long. Kargash reached the western wall in 2 minutes. It should have been less than a minute. The enemy's ladders were crude but effective. Countermeasures were needed. Hooks on the walls to push the ladders away, or a log canopy that would prevent a ladder from being placed right up against the wall. He broke down each point piece by piece and found a solution. He wrote down each solution using sticks on a clay tablet. Targ sat nearby and memorized it. He already knew how to read these sticks. His own system of recording. Not letters, not runes, diagrams. Lines and dots that denoted length, height, and angle. A language that Groom had been teaching him since the first week. Targ was his memory, his notebook, his hard drive on 2 legs. On the 4th day after the battle, guests arrived at the gates. Not enemies, and not refugees. 3 orcs from the Grey Wolf tribe. A small clan 2 days' journey to the east. They had come to look. Rumors of the wall that had stopped the Bloodaxe had spread across the steppe faster than the wind. Orcs weren't good at keeping secrets, but they were good at telling stories. And the story of how 65 orcs behind a stone wall had defeated 170 was too good not to tell. The 3 visitors stood by the wall and touched the bricks. One of them tapped it with his fist. Then he struck it harder. His piston bounced off. He looked at his hand, then at the wall, then at Groom, and asked who had built it. Durgan answered, "The blacksmith's son." The guest looked down at Groom, a frail teenager. Green skin gray with exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, arms as thin as twigs. The guest said he didn't believe it. Groom didn't argue. He asked what the Grey Wolf wanted. The guest paused. Then he spoke plainly. Their chieftain wants a wall just like this one. He's willing to pay. With livestock, salt, metal. Groom looked at Durgan. The chieftain was looking at him, waiting. For the first time, Durgan was waiting for a decision from Groom, rather than making it himself. Groom replied to the guests, "Not the wall. He won't give them a wall. A wall is knowledge, and knowledge isn't sold for livestock. But he'll offer something else. Let the Grey Wolf send 10 young orcs, strong ones, capable of learning. Groom will teach them how to build. They'll return home and build the wall themselves. In exchange, the Grey Wolf will give Crackstone 50 heads of livestock and 2 sacks of salt." The guests exchanged glances. 10 young orcs for training. That was unheard of. Orcs didn't learn from strangers. Orcs learned from their fathers. Or they didn't learn at all. They said they would relay the message to their chieftain, and they left. A week later, 10 young orcs from Grey Wolf arrived. They brought livestock with them, 53 sheep and 2 bulls, and 3 sacks of salt. More than Groom had asked for. The chieftain of Grey Wolf had added some of his own. For the first time, Groom saw a profit. Not money, but resources. Enough food for 6 weeks. Salt for preserving meat. A workforce for training. He had created a business model in a world that didn't know the word business. Knowledge in exchange for resources. Students in exchange for safety. Every trained tribe was a potential ally. Every ally meant fewer enemies. Fewer enemies meant a better chance of surviving until spring. He trained the Grey Wolf students alongside his own crew. One curriculum: foundations, masonry, mortar, drainage, chimney, and kiln. They learned quickly, young and hungry for knowledge. For the first time in their lives, they were being shown not how to kill, but how to create. And for them, this was a revelation no less significant than the well had been for cracked stone. At the end of the 3rd month, another delegation arrived, from the Iron Claw tribe, then from White Smoke, then from Bone Paw. 4 tribes in a month. Each wanted a wall. Each offered resources.
Groom welcomed them all.
The terms were the same: apprentices plus resources. He wasn't building walls. He was building a network. The settlement grew. With every new group of apprentices and every shipment of resources, it became larger and stronger. 254 orcs became 300, then 350. New huts were now being built according to Groom's design, with foundations, with drainage, with insulation, with proper chimneys. He began planning the streets. Not a chaotic cluster of houses, but a structure, a central street running from the gate to the well. Cross alleys. The distance between houses was 3 steps, enough to walk through with a load, but not enough to let a war boar through. Every alley was a defensive line. Every intersection was a checkpoint. A city like a fortress like a city. He stood on the tower and looked down at it. Neat rows of houses. Smoke rising from the chimneys. People in the streets. Children playing in the snow. Not hungry, not freezing, alive. Targ stood beside him. Targ said it was beautiful. Groom looked at him.
Targ was looking at the settlement with an expression Groom had never seen on an orc's face before. Tenderness. A rough, skinny teenage orc, with his mouth perpetually agape, was looking at the neat houses and chimneys and seeing beauty. Not strength, not power. The beauty of order. That was the moment when Groom realized he wasn't just building houses. He was building people who saw the world differently, who looked at a wall and saw not an obstacle but protection. At a chimney, they see not a hole in the roof, but care. At a well, they see not a pit but life. He was building a new consciousness, one brick at a time. At the end of the 3rd month, Urzel struck a second blow. Subtler than the first. Cleverer. He did not demand a trial. He did not summon spirits. He came to Durgan and said quietly, "The boy is building well, but the boy is building for strangers. 10 orcs of the Grey Wolf, 10 of the Iron Claw, 10 of the White Smoke. Stranger orcs are roaming our settlement. They see our walls. They count our warriors. They know our weak spots. Today they are apprentices. Tomorrow they'll be scouts. The day after tomorrow, their tribes will come and strike at the places their apprentices have memorized." Durgan listened and nodded, because Urzel spoke sensibly. No lies, no curses, just logic. Durgan summoned Groom. He laid out his fears. Groom stood in thought. Urzel was right. Partially. The apprentices really had seen everything. They knew the layout of the walls and towers and the weak spots. If their tribes decided to attack, that knowledge would be a weapon. But Urzel hadn't taken one thing into account. Groom didn't stop. Every day the settlement changed. New walls, new fortifications, new streets. What the students had seen yesterday was already outdated today. Knowledge of a static fortress was valuable. Knowledge of a fortress that was being built every day was useless, because by the time of the attack, it would already be different. He explained this to Durgan. The chieftain thought for a moment. Then he asked how the boy knew all this. Groom replied that he simply thought. Durgan looked at him for a long time. Then he said he would allow the students to stay. But Groom had to build faster, always faster than the enemy could memorize. Groom nodded. Urzel had lost yet another round. But Groom had seen the look in his eyes as the shaman left the chieftain's hut. Not anger, Patience. Urzel wasn't giving up. He was waiting, biding his time, preparing something bigger. Groom didn't know what, but he knew it was looking. That night, Rika came to the wall. Groom was there. He was inspecting the masonry on the northern section, looking for cracks after the enemy battering ram had struck it 3 times. There were no cracks. The mortar held. Rika stood nearby. She was silent. Then she said she had performed a ritual. Quietly. At night. Without her father. She consecrated the wall. She summoned the spirits of fire that dwelt in every fired brick. She asked them to protect those who lived beyond the wall. She said this, and her voice trembled. Not from the cold. From fear. She had broken her father's ban. She had gone against the shaman, against tradition, against everything she knew. Because she believed the wall deserved a blessing. That what Groom was building was right. That the spirits should be with those who build, not with those who destroy. Groom stood there looking at her. Red braids, tattoos on her arms. 16 years old. A girl who defied her father for the sake of the wall, for the sake of what she believed in. He thanked her. Orcish, the word sounded rough and curt. But she heard in it what he meant. She nodded and walked off into the darkness. He stood by the wall, which was now consecrated, and thought that in this world where strength decided everything, the strongest act he had ever witnessed had been performed by a 16-year-old girl who had quietly prayed at night by a stone wall. Winter truly struck in the 4th month. Not the winter that had come before. That had been a prelude. The real long winter came like a wall. In a single night, the temperature dropped so much that the water in the well was covered with a crust of ice 2 fingers thick. Snow fell relentlessly for 3 days. By the morning of the 4th day, the drifts reached halfway up the wall. The wind howled through the cracks between the bricks, and even the insulated huts groaned under the pressure. Groom stood on the tower and gazed at the white nothingness. There was no horizon. There was no sky. There was only snow, above, below, and on all sides. He climbed down and began to take inventory. Supplies. Enough meat in the storeroom for 40 days, with the sheep from the Grey Wolf, Sideworth. There was salt. Firewood for 20 days at the current rate of consumption. It wasn't enough. The long winter lasted 8 months. 60 days worth of food for 8 months. The math didn't add up. He convened a council. Not the elders. His own council. Targ, Bernie, Shaka, Crag, Farney, Kargash, Garak, and Hrogar. For the first time, his father came to his meeting of his own accord. He sat down nearby and remained silent. He waited, just like everyone else. Groom laid out the problem. 2 months' worth of food. 8 months of winter. They needed to stretch their supplies and find new sources. He proposed 3 solutions. First, rationing. Every orc would receive a set portion each day. No more, no less. The same for everyone. The warriors wanted to object. A warrior eats more because a warrior expends more energy. Groom replied that right now the warriors had no one to fight. The snow had buried all the trails. No clan would go on a raid waist-deep in snow. There's no threat. So a warrior eats as much as everyone else. Kargash clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. Because Groom was right. Second, ice fishing. The stream had frozen over, but water was still flowing beneath the ice. And where there was flowing water, there were fish. Groom had seen how people fished in winter in documentaries about Inuit life. A hole in the ice, a line made of sinew, a bone hook, bait made of intestines. Primitive, but it had worked for thousands of years among peoples who lived in similar conditions. He didn't know the details, but he knew the principle. And the principle was enough to get started. Third, greenhouses. There was no translation for this word in Orok. Groom explained it another way. A house for plants, stone walls, a roof made of stretched animal intestines, semi-transparent, letting light through. Inside, warmth from the stove. In the warm, moist soil, root vegetables and greens can be grown, even in winter. The orcs looked at him as if he'd suggested flying to the moon. Plants in winter, in the snow, under a roof. It was beyond their understanding of the world.
Plants grow in summer because the sun tells them to grow. In winter, the sun sleeps. Plants sleep. Every child knows that. Groom didn't argue. He built a greenhouse in 5 days. A small one, 3 by 4 meters. Stone walls up to waist height. Above that, a frame of poles covered with processed intestines. The intestines were translucent and let in the dim winter light. Inside stood a small stove. Not for heat, for temperature. Groom kept the temperature inside around 10 degrees. Enough so that the soil wouldn't freeze and the roots could grow. He planted the wild onion bulbs that Shaka had found in the fall and kept in a basket, and the seeds of some local root vegetable resembling a turnip. 2 weeks later, green shoots emerged from the ground. Nahi was the first to see them. She was standing in the corner, looking at the green shoot poking out of the black soil. In winter. Under a roof made of intestines, in the warmth. Outside it was -30 and white death. And here, a green shoot. She touched it with her finger, gently, as if it were a living creature. Then she looked at Groom. Her face bore an expression he had seen on the faces of people on Earth when they first saw something impossible. A miracle. For her, it was a miracle. For him, it was a first lesson in biology and a bit of common sense. But for a 7-year-old orc girl who had never seen greenery in winter, it was proof that her brother could do anything. Word of the greenhouse spread within a day. Orcs came to look. They stood at the entrance and peered inside. Some refused to and walked away. Some stood there in silence. Urzel came too. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the green sprouts. His face was a mask, but Groom saw his hands trembling on his staff. Plants in winter. This wasn't just a violation of tradition. It was a violation of the laws of the world as Urzel knew it. Winter kills. That is the law. Groom was building a world where winter didn't kill, where water didn't freeze, where walls didn't crumble, where smoke rose upward instead of into the lungs, where plants grew while the sun slept. To Urzel, this wasn't building. It was blasphemy. Ice fishing got underway on the 3rd day. Garok turned out to be a natural fisherman. He sat by the hole in the ice for hours, motionless, patient. His hands pulled fish after fish from the water. Small, silvery, no bigger than the palm of his hand each one. But 20 fish a day meant 20 extra portions. After a week, he had 5 apprentices. After 2 weeks, they were catching 60 fish a day, 60 portions. For 350 mouths to feed, it was a drop in the ocean. But a drop plus a drop plus a drop fills the ocean. Traps, fish, supplies in the warehouse, rationing, the greenhouse. Groom would tally everything up and recount it every evening. Sticks on clay tablets. The numbers didn't lie. At their current rate of consumption and intake, they would make it to spring. Barely, with no reserves. But they would make it, if nothing happened. In the 6th week of the long winter, something happened. Wolves. Not ordinary wolves. Bone wolves. Magical beasts the size of a calf. White fur and bones protruding through their skin like armor. Their eyes were empty and glowing. A pack of 20 came from the north. Hungry. Desperate. Winter was driving them south, and they had caught the scent of livestock behind the wall. They attacked at night. 5 of them leaped over the reinforced palisade on the southern side, where there was no stone wall. An orc sentry raised the alarm. His cry roused the entire settlement. Kargash was the first on the scene. He clashed with a bone wolf in an alley between the huts. The beast leaped. Kargash struck with his sword. The blade slid across the bone plates without leaving a mark. The wolf sank its teeth into his shoulder. Kargash roared in pain and grabbed the beast by the throat with his bare hands. He squeezed. His fingers found a soft spot between the bone plates. There was a crunch. The wolf went limp. The southern wall was being built during the most brutal cold spell the tribe had ever known. The temperature dropped so low that a spit of saliva would freeze before it reached the ground. The mortar would set before the mason had time to lay a brick. Groom solved the problem with hot water. They mixed the mortar with boiling water from the well. The hot mortar remained workable for 10 minutes instead of 1. 10 minutes for each batch. That was enough for 5 bricks. 5 bricks at a time.
thousands of times, day after day. He ordered the builders to work in short shifts, an hour on the wall, an hour by the fire, another hour on the wall. Continuous work in the cold was killing their fingers. Frostbite was worse than any enemy. An orc without fingers cannot wield a sword. He can't wield a hammer. He can't eat. He becomes a burden. Groom couldn't afford to lose a single builder. Kargash got back on his feet a week later. His right shoulder was bandaged and his arm hung in a sling. He could hold a shovel with his left hand. He came to the construction site and took his place in line. No one said a word to him. He dug with his left hand and dug more slowly than before. But he was there. In the third week of construction, people arrived. Not orcs. People. 3 of them. 2 men and a woman, wearing heavy fur cloaks, riding mules loaded with bundles. Merchants. From the south. They were traveling across the steppe, along the winter trade routes that connected human cities with the outlands. They had no intention of entering the orc settlement, but one of the mules had broken its leg, and they were looking for shelter from the blizzard. They saw the wall and stopped. They stood at the gate, unable to believe their eyes. A stone wall, belonging to the orcs, with towers, with a gate on iron hinges, with chimneys, with a well. The eldest of the merchants introduced himself as Rem Torvis, a man of about 50, a graying beard, shrewd eyes, hands disfigured by frostbite from long ago. He had been trading with the orcs for 20 years. He knew their language. He knew their customs. He knew that orcs lived in filth and fought over scraps. And now he stood in the middle of a settlement with straight streets and stone houses, and he couldn't close his mouth. Durgan allowed them to stay until the blizzard passed. Groom settled them in the guest hut. Yes, he already had a guest hut. One of the first built according to the new design, specifically for such occasions. Warm, dry, with a stove and ventilation. Rem Torvis sat by the stove, drinking hot water from a clay mug, and said nothing. Then he asked who had built it. Groom replied that he had. Rem looked at him, at the frail little orc, at his green hands with black nails, at his tired eyes. Then he said that in human cities they pay in gold for walls like these, that master masons train for 20 years, that engineers are as highly regarded as nobles. He asked how an orc boy knew what even the best human builders know. Groom replied that he simply looked at the stones and saw how they wanted to be laid. Rem didn't believe him, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he proposed a trade. He had goods that weren't available in the settlement. Fabric. Real woven fabric, not animal hides. Iron nails. A sack of dried herbs. Hemp ropes. Tools. 3 steel chisels of better quality than anything Hrogar had ever forged. Groom looked at the chisels and his breath caught in his throat. Steel. Real hardened steel. With chisels like these, he could work stone 3 times faster, make precise joints, cut grooves for connections, raise the quality of the masonry to a level that was impossible with orc tools. He asked the price. Rem named his price. Adjusted for local standards, it came to 20 sheep for 3 chisels. A ripoff. Groom knew the prices, not the local ones, but those on Earth. 3 chisels cost as much to produce as a single sheep. A 20-fold markup. A standard monopolist's margin. He didn't haggle. Instead, he showed Rem the kiln. He showed him the bricks. He showed him the adobe blocks. He showed him the shocky wickerwork. He showed him the willow rings for wells. Everything they produced. Rem watched. His shrewd eyes calculated faster than any sticks on a tally board. He saw goods that weren't found in the markets of human cities. Standard-sized fired bricks. Woven baskets more than any made by humans. Smoothly shaped earthenware. In human cities, these were worth money. Good money. Groom proposed a barter. Not sheep for chisels, bricks for chisels, baskets for cloth, clay pottery for nails. A fair exchange. Rem thought about it for 3 days. The blizzard lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, when the wind died down, he shook Groom's hand and said he would return in a month, with a caravan. Groom stood at the gate and watched as 3 figures on 2 mules rode off across the white steppe. Trade. A connection to the outside world. Resources they didn't have, and would never have without contact with people. Steel, cloth, tools. In exchange for what they knew how to make better than anyone else. Bricks, pottery, woven goods. Nahi stood nearby. She asked if the people would return. Groom replied that they would. Because people need what we make, and we need what they make. And when two sides need each other, they don't go to war. Nahi thought for a moment. Then she said it sounded like friendship. Groom looked at the 7-year-old orc girl with a broken fang who had just described the basis of international trade with the word friendship. He placed his hand on her head. Warm. Alive. She wasn't cold anymore. Rem returned 6 weeks later, not alone, with a caravan of 8 mules and 4 assistants. He brought steel, 20 kilograms in ingots, iron nails, woven linen cloth, ropes, seeds, real grain seeds that people grew in their fields, wheat, barley, peas. Groom held the little bag of seeds, and his hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the realization of what he was holding. Grains, a stable source of calories. 1 hectare of wheat could feed 20 orcs a year. 10 hectares would feed 200. An entire village. No hunting, no traps, no dependence on the migration of game. Agriculture. The Neolithic Revolution. Humans went through it 10,000 years ago. The orcs hadn't gotten there yet. Until today. He hid the seeds in the driest and warmest place in the settlement. In the greenhouse, where they would wait for spring. A spring that, for the first time in the tribe's history, signified not just the end of the cold, but the beginning of something new. Rem brought more than just goods. He brought information. Groom invited him into the guest hut and listened. Rem spoke of the world beyond the steppe, of the human kingdoms to the south, of the elven cities to the west, of trade routes, wars, and politics, and of how rumors of an orc city with walls had reached the human lords. Rem said this calmly, but his eyes were serious. He said that the lords of the borderlands were discussing it. Some thought it was just a rumor. Some had sent out scouts. Some were already talking about a punitive expedition. Orcs building walls. That wasn't a curiosity, it was a threat. Groom listened and felt a chill run down his spine. Not the cold of winter, a different kind. Human armies, knights in armor, archers, mages, siege engines. Against his walls of fired brick and a garrison of 60 orcs with axes. He asked how much time he had. Rem shrugged. He said the lords were slow. That winter had closed the mountain passes. That in early spring they'd be busy with the sowing. Summer, maybe fall. A year. Maybe 2 if he was lucky. Groom nodded. A year. Maybe 2. When Rem left, Groom sat alone in the dark hut and thought. 3 fronts. Urzel on the inside. The other clans on the outside. The people from the south. Any one of them could destroy everything he had built. And together, they were an inevitability. He couldn't fight on 3 fronts. So he had to eliminate at least one. Urzel, the internal front. The most dangerous, because a strike could come at any moment from where you least expected it. Groom went to Rika. He found her in the sanctuary. Smoke still filled the room. The chimney he'd suggested during the first week had never been built. Urzel had forbidden it. Rika sat by the fire, her eyes red and her cheeks wet. She was coughing. Groom sat down beside her. He asked her directly, was she ready? She looked at him through tears stung by the smoke. She asked what for. He said he was going to build a chimney in the sanctuary, today, without Urzel's permission. That this would be an open challenge to the shaman. That the consequences would be serious. That he needed her, not as a secret ally, but as a shamaness who would stand beside him and declare that the spirits needed a clear path upward. Rika was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. Smoke swirled. She coughed. Then she said her father would kill them both. Groom replied that her father had already tried, and failed. She looked at him, at his slender hands, at his stubborn eyes, at the burns on his legs that still hadn't fully healed. She said one word. Yes. They built the chimney in 4 hours. Groom, Bernie, Rog, and Rika, who held the tools and shooed away onlookers. A clay pipe above the fire, tapered toward the top, exiting through the roof. When Groom lit the fire in the hearth, the smoke rose, in a steady stream, through the pipe, up to the roof, into the sky. For the first time in hundreds of years, it was possible to breathe in the sanctuary. Rika stood by the fire and watched the flames. Pure, steady, golden. Not through a veil of smoke, not through tears. Directly. She saw every tongue of fire, every dance of the flame, every sign the fire sent. She said that now she could truly read the will of the spirits, that her whole life she had seen only shadows through the smoke, and now she sees the light. Urzel arrived an hour later. He stood in the doorway of the sanctuary and looked at the chimney, at the clean air, at his daughter, who stood by the fire with dry eyes and steady breathing, at Groom, who stood nearby. Urzel entered, slowly. His staff tapped against the stone floor. He stopped by the fire. He looked at the flames. At a pure, bright flame he had never seen in his life. For 50 years, he had entered the sanctuary and choked on the smoke. For 50 years, he had read the signs through tears and a haze. For 50 years, he had thought that was how it was supposed to be. That the pain from the smoke was the price of speaking with the spirits. That the spirits demanded suffering. He stared at the flame and his face changed. Slowly. Layer by layer. Anger. Confusion. Doubt. Fear. And finally, something Groom hadn't expected to see. Grief. Urzel sat down by the fire. Weakly. Like an old man who had carried a burden for 50 years and suddenly realized he'd been carrying it in vain. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that his grandson had died 3 winters ago. A little boy. 4 years old. He died of a cough. The kind of cough that comes from breathing smoke every day. He said that he had treated his grandson with prayers and smoke. More smoke. Because smoke is the breath of the spirits, and the spirits were supposed to heal the boy. He breathed in the smoke and coughed, and breathed in and coughed, and one morning he stopped breathing altogether. Urzel sat by the clean fire, his hands resting on his knees, palms up, empty. He said that if there had been a chimney back then, maybe his grandson would still be alive. Groom sat down next to him. He said nothing. There were no words that could fix this. A dead child remains dead. No chimney will bring him back. But living children can breathe clean air. All living children. Starting today. Urzel looked at Groom. Old yellow eyes into young brown ones. A shaman and a builder. Tradition into the future. He didn't say he forgave him. He didn't say he was wrong. He said he wouldn't interfere anymore. For Urzel, this was more than a surrender. It was courage. Spring arrived like an explosion. The snow began to melt in just 1 week. Streams rushed down the slopes. The ground thawed. The drainage ditches worked at full capacity, carrying meltwater away from the houses. Not a single hut was flooded. Not a single wall was waterlogged. The system that Groom had been building for 5 months had passed its first test. He stood on the tower and tallied the winter's losses. 0. 0 deaths from the cold. 0 deaths from starvation. 0 children buried in the frozen ground. For the first time in the history of the Cracked Stone Tribe, not a single orc had died during the long winter. 2 elders had died of old age. 1 warrior had perished during an attack by bone wolves. 3 had died from wounds sustained in battle against the blood axe. But from the winter. From that winter that, once every 100 years, killed 3/4 of the tribes. 0. Rumors spread across the steppe in the very first month of the thaw. A tribe that had survived the long winter without any losses. A tribe with stone walls. A tribe with plants in winter. A tribe where the water doesn't freeze. They began arriving at the end of the first week of spring. Refugees, families, entire clans. The Grey Feather Tribe, 32 orcs. They'd lost half their number over the winter. Their chieftain had died of the cold. All that remained were women, children, and 8 warriors. They arrived and stood at the gate. Silently. They waited. Groom received them, the Black Stream Tribe, 41 orcs. Their chieftain led them himself. He said he'd heard about the city. He said he wanted to live. Not to fight. Not to plunder. To live. Groom accepted them. The Bone Wind Tribe, 27 orcs. All wounded. Red Fang had routed them on their way here. They'd been crawling for the last 2 days. Groom accepted them. By the end of the first month of spring, the population had grown to 500, then to 600, then to 700. The city grew like a living creature. New neighborhoods sprang up in a week. Work crews operated according to a system that Groom had refined all winter. Foundations in 2 days, walls in 4, roof in 2, stove in 1 day. Every house was built according to a standard design. Same size, same layout, same quality. An assembly line. The first school opened while the ground was still damp from the melting snow. 1 hut, 10 students. Nahi taught the classes. An 8-year-old girl taught teenagers and adults how to read blueprints. She stood in front of the class with a stick in her hand and pointed to a clay tablet covered in lines. She explained what each line meant. Every dot, every symbol. Her voice was soft but firm. Her chipped fang did not prevent her from speaking clearly and distinctly. Groom stood by the door and watched. His little sister. The archivist of a city that was not supposed to exist. The first teacher in the history of the orcs. The planting season began in mid-spring. The seeds Rem had brought were more precious than gold. Groom set aside a plot of land east of the city for the fields. Level ground. Good soil. Close to a stream for irrigation. He didn't know agronomy, but he knew the principles. Furrows at a certain distance apart. Seeds at a certain depth. Watering. Weeding. The orcs watched him just as they had watched him build the greenhouse. With skepticism. With hope. With a willingness to believe in yet another miracle. When the first green shoots of wheat emerged from the ground, Nahi brought her entire class to watch. 10 orcs stood at the edge of the field and gazed at the green shoots. To them, these weren't just plants. They were a promise that the next winter would be different. The city received its name in the first month of spring. It wasn't Groom who gave it. The orcs gave it themselves. They named it Kar Groom. In Orcish, this meant Groom's Stone. He tried to object. He said that the city belonged to everyone, that his name shouldn't be in the title. Durgan looked at him and said that orcs name things after whoever created them. A blacksmith's axe bears the blacksmith's name. A builder's city bears the builder's name. Groom fell silent. Kar Groom. So be it. In the middle of spring, he set out on an expedition he'd been planning for 3 months. Into the mountains. In search of the ruins spoken of in ancient legends. The ruins of the first city. He took Targa with him, Bernie, Raiku, and Kargash. They walked for 3 days to the northwest. Into the foothills where the coniferous forest gave way to cliffs. Rika led them. She knew the legends. She knew the songs that showed the way. Songs her father used to sing when he thought no one was listening. They found the ruins on the 3rd day. The remains of walls made of stone laid with mortar joints. Fragments of foundations. Collapsed arches. Traces of a drainage system. Groom walked among the ruins, his heart pounding. 1,000 years ago someone had built here. Someone who knew the same principles, the same laws of physics, the same engineering solutions. Joint bonding, drainage, arched structures, buttresses. He found a cellar, half buried. Beneath a collapsed wall, Bernie and Kargash cleared the debris in half a day. Inside was a room. Dry. The stone walls still stood. The ceiling, made of stone slabs, was supported by an arch. A stone table stood in the room. Clay tablets lay on the table. Dozens of them, covered with lines and symbols. Blueprints. Groom picked up the first one. His hands were shaking. A water wheel. A diagram of a water wheel with calculations for the diameter and number of blades. He picked up the second one. An aqueduct. A system for supplying water through an inclined channel from a mountain spring. The third. A kiln 10 times his size, with several chambers and staged heating. The fourth. A windmill. The fifth. A smelter with water-powered bellows. Each tablet was a revelation. Each saved him months of trial and error. He would have figured it out on his own, sooner or later, but the tablets gave him time he didn't have. Beneath the stack of tablets lay another one, a different one, not a drawing, text, carved into the clay with a thin, sharp tool. In Orcish, Groom read slowly. His knowledge of Orcish script was still limited, but he understood. The text spoke of a builder, of one who had come from another world. A year later, Groom stood on the central tower of Car Groom and looked out over the city. Not a settlement, a city. Stone walls all around the perimeter, 4 towers at the corners, a gatehouse with double gates. Inside, 3 quarters, the Orc Quarter, the largest. 4 streets intersecting 2. Houses made of fired brick on stone foundations, each with a stove, a chimney, drainage, and a dry floor. The Reception Quarter, for those who arrived later, for refugees, resettlers, and all those driven out by others. The houses are smaller but just as warm and sturdy. The Crafts Quarter, Krogar's smithy, which had tripled in size and now operated with water-powered bellows based on blueprints from the ruins of the first city. Pottery Workshop, Carpentry Workshop, Weaving Workshop. Nahi's School, where 30 students studied blueprints and did math. Greenhouses, 3 of them, fresh greens all year round. Fields beyond the walls, wheat, barley, peas. The first harvest was meager, the second will be better. The third will feed everyone. A water supply system made of wooden pipes from a mountain spring. The water flowed through a sloped canal for 2 kilometers and into a stone reservoir in the city center. From the reservoir, pipes carried it to wells in every neighborhood. Clean, cold, endless. Population, 1,200 orcs, plus 43 humans, plus 4 half-orcs, plus 1 goblin whom no one could drive out because he was the best at mending shoes. 1,250 living beings who, a year ago, had been doomed. Now they were citizens of a city that wasn't supposed to exist. Down below in the square by the well, it was just another ordinary day. Women were carrying water. Children were running to school. The blacksmith was striking his anvil. The baker was kneading dough. Yes, they had a baker. The first in Orc history. An old man from the Bonewind tribe who, until then, had spent his whole life roasting meat on a stick and suddenly discovered that flour, water, and an oven created something that made 2-meter-tall warriors weak at the knees. Bread. Groom smirked. Bread had won over more hearts than all of its walls combined. Mira arrived 3 months ago, a half-orc from the south. 19 years old, green eyes, delicate features, 3 languages, a sharp mind. She came because she'd heard the impossible, an orc city with running water. She didn't believe it and came to check. She checked. She stayed. Groom made her treasurer. He gave her a room with a wooden floor and a window, the first place in her life that belonged to her. When she saw the door with a lock, she stood there and touched the latch. She opened it. She closed it. She opened it. Then she sat down on the floor and covered her face with her hands. Groom left and quietly closed the door behind him. Outside. So she could be alone. For the first time in her life. In her own space. Behind her own door. Mireille became a bridge between the city and the human merchants. She spoke their language. She understood their customs. She knew how to bargain. Rem Torvis came every month now. Other merchants came with him. The city traded bricks and ceramics and woven goods and received steel and cloth and seeds and books. Yes, books. Mireille had asked for books. When Groom found out, he almost hugged her right there in front of everyone. Olga arrived in the middle of summer. A warrior from the Blood Axe clan. 2 meters tall. A scar across her eyebrow. A tattoo of the defeated clan on her shoulder. After the battle at the walls of Car Groom, the Blood Axe clan split. Togrul led the loyalists east. The rest scattered. Olga was the daughter of a charioteer who had died during the assault. She wandered for half a year. She came to the gates and waited for death or slavery. Groom ordered that she be fed and treated, and he offered her a choice. She chose to stay. When, at Groom's request, Krogar forged armor for her to fit her exact measurements, not a modified men's suit, but genuine armor tailored to her body. She stood before a mirror of polished bronze and looked at herself. For the first time in her life, she had armor in which she could move freely. Armor that didn't constrict or chafed. That was made for her. She turned to Groom and asked why. Why was he doing this for an enemy? He replied that he had no enemies. There were people who had not yet found a home. She became the commander of his personal guard that very day. No one appointed her. She simply stood behind him and didn't leave.
Red Fang arrived at the end of summer. Not the chieftain himself. The chieftain had sent envoys, 3 orcs in full battle paint. They stood at the gates and demanded that Groom be handed over. Red Fang's high shaman declared him spiritually tainted. A heretic. A bounty was placed on his head. Durgan went out to meet the envoys. Behind him stood 120 warriors in formation. Archers were stationed on the walls. Lookouts were on duty in the towers. Durgan told the envoys that they could convey 2 words to their chieftain. Come. Try. The envoys left. Groom had been preparing for war all year. He knew it would come. The question was when and with what force. Scouts, trained disciples from neighboring tribes, sent back intelligence. Red Fang was assembling an army. 10,000 warriors from all the subordinate tribes, with siege ladders, battering rams, and war boars. Gar Bonebreaker, Red Fang's chieftain. Clever, dangerous, charismatic. A man who sincerely believed that orcs should remain hunters and warriors. That building was a form of degeneration. That Groom was a disease that needed to be eradicated. Their meeting took place the day before the battle. Gar came alone, to the gates, unarmed. He asked for a conversation. Groom came out, alone too. Olga stood behind the gates with her sword drawn and an expression that said if Gar touched the builder, he would die before he could blink. Gar looked at the city, at the walls, at the towers, at the chimneys, at the water pipe that entered the city through the western wall. Then at Groom. He said he saw, that he understood. That Groom had created something that had never existed before. But this something would kill the orcs, or rather any blade. Because orcs were born to run across the steppe, not to sit behind walls. Because the steppe makes them strong, while the walls will make them weak. Because in 2 generations, the orcs behind the walls will forget how to wield an axe and become just like humans. Soft, weak, dependent, prey. Groom listened. He didn't interrupt. Because Gar wasn't speaking nonsense, he was speaking his truth. A sincere one, a terrifying one, a possible one. Groom replied. He said he understood Gar's fear, that he himself feared the same thing. That walls could become a prison rather than a defense. That comfort could kill more surely than hunger. But he said there was a difference. Weakness is when you have no choice. When you run across the steppe because you can't stop. When you fight because you don't know how to do anything else. When you lose children every winter because you don't know how to build a stove. That's not strength. That's a lack of options. But strength is when you can build a wall and can step outside of it. When you can feed a child and can pick up an axe. When you have a choice and you choose for yourself. Jihar was silent. Then he said that Groom spoke beautifully, but tomorrow the swords would do the talking. He turned and walked away. Groom stood at the gate and watched him go. He knew that tomorrow one of them would die. And he regretted it. The battle began at dawn. 10,000 orcs of Red Fang stood on the plain before Kar Groom, a black mass stretching from horizon to horizon. The drums beat so that the earth shook beneath their feet. War boars bellowed and dug at the ground with their tusks. The defenders stood on the walls. 620, not 65 like a year ago. 620. Warriors of Cracked Stone, and Grey Wolf, and Ironclaw, and White Smoke, and Bone Paw, and 10 other tribes that had sent their fighters, who had studied at Groom's school, who had built their walls according to his blueprints, who had come to defend the city because the city was their home too. Groom stood on the central tower. Before him lay a map of the city and its surroundings. 3 drummers stood nearby. It was the signaling system he had developed over the past 6 months. Each combination of beats signaled a command. Reinforce the left flank. The right flank retreats to the second line. Reserves to the west. Catapults, fire. His voice could not reach every defender, but the drums could. He had transformed the city into a single, unified organism. Every defender knew his place. Every catapult was aimed at a specific square. Every moat was dug at a calculated distance. He wasn't fighting, he was commanding. Gar launched the first wave. 3,000. They ran toward the northern wall with ladders and grappling hooks, the first line of traps, pits, stakes, ropes, camouflaged ditches filled with water that had frozen into an ice rink. 300 orcs fell in the first 30 seconds.
The second line. Catapults. 4 of them. Built according to blueprints from the ruins of the first city. Improved by Groom. Stones the size of a barrel flew along a curved trajectory and slammed into the dense ranks of the attackers. Each stone took out 10 to 15 of them. The third line. The wall. 2.5 meters of fired brick set in lime mortar, with a parapet that prevented ladders from being set against it, with chutes for boiling water, with arrow slits for archers. The first wave crashed against the wall in 40 minutes, losing 700 orcs. Gar sent in the second wave, 5,000. With battering rams. 3 battering rams on wheels, heavy ones, made from the trunks of centuries-old trees bound with iron. They crept toward the gates slowly and inexorably. Groom had been waiting for this. In front of the gates, he had dug a moat, a wide one, 3 meters wide, deep, 2 meters deep. At the bottom lay sharpened stakes and broken stones. The battering rams could not cross the moat. They stopped at the edge. The orcs pushing them became targets for the archers on the walls. Gar withdrew the battering rams. He launched a third wave from the west. The wall was thinner there. There was a chance there. Kargash was waiting for them. He stood on the western wall with 200 warriors. His shoulder had long since healed. His sword was in his hand. His face was calm. When the enemies began scaling the wall, Kargash did not wait at the top. He leaped down into the thick of the enemy. 2 meters 20 and 130 kilograms of fury crashed down on the attackers like a rockfall. 20 more followed him. A counterattack at a moment when the enemy least expected it. The western flank of Red Fang charged forward. The battle lasted until noon, 6 hours. Gar sent wave after wave of attackers. Each wave crashed against the walls, rolled back from the moats, or fell into traps. The city ran like clockwork. Drums pounded. The defenders shifted positions. The catapults were reloaded. The wounded were carried off to the hospital. Yes, the hospital. Hyarin had arrived a month ago, an elven engineer, a runaway student from the Magic Academy, slender, fair-haired, with ink stains on her fingers. She'd come to inspect the water pipes and stayed for good. Groom laid the catapult blueprint in front of her and asked where he'd gone wrong. She found 2 errors in 10 minutes and laughed for the first time in 3 years. He built her a drafting workshop with slanted tables and lamps fueled by fish oil. She became his chief collaborator. Together, they designed a hospital in a week, with private rooms, ventilation, and a sterilizer for instruments. The hospital was waiting for a doctor. The doctor arrived a week before the battle. Jessica Moreno, 24 years old, a former military medic, the second time traveler. She had walked across the steppe for 3 years in the body of a wandering healer. She came to Kar Groom because she couldn't believe what she had heard. A Roman aqueduct in the middle of the Orok steppes. She entered the city and stopped. She stood at the gate and looked at the walls, the aqueduct, the chimneys, and the straight streets. Then she heard a frail young Orok on the tower quietly mutter a single word under his breath. A single, earthly word. One that only a person from her world could say. She climbed up to the tower. They looked at each other. A teenage Orocho boy and a human woman. 2 strangers in a strange world. She asked quietly. He nodded. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. For 3 years she'd thought she was alone. For 3 years she'd been pretending. For 3 years she'd been afraid of going mad. Groom stood beside her, silent. Then he said he would build her a hospital. A real one. She lifted her face, looked at him with tear-filled eyes, and said he was crazy. He replied that it wasn't the first time someone had told him that. Now Jess was in the hospital. She was treating the wounded. Her hands worked as only the hands of a military surgeon could work. Quickly, precisely, without any unnecessary movements. She was saving those whom Groom couldn't save with the walls. Those who stood on the walls and fell. By noon, Gar had lost 3,000, killed and wounded, a third of his army. His orcs stood on the plain and did not advance, for the first time in the entire war. Not out of fear, out of confusion. They didn't know how to fight a wall. They knew how to fight orcs, how to fight humans, how to fight beasts. But the wall wasn't alive. It didn't tire. It wasn't afraid. It didn't retreat. It simply stood there. Gar sat on his boar and looked at the city. His face was ashen. He saw what Groom had seen a year ago while looking at his blueprints. The numbers didn't add up. 10,000 against the wall isn't the same as 10,000 against 600. It's 10,000 against stone and fire and water. Stone never tires. Fire never sleeps. Water shows no mercy. Then something happened that Gar didn't expect. Groom opened the gates. Not to attack. Women carrying stretchers emerged from the gates. They were heading toward the battlefield, toward the wounded, toward the enemy's wounded. Red Fang's orcs lay on the ground, bleeding out. Cargroom's women lifted them onto the stretchers and carried them into the city. To the hospital, where Jess stitched up their wounds, staunched the bleeding, and gave them water. Clean, cold, well water. Gar watched this from a distance of 200 paces. His face was changing. Slowly. Like Ursula's face by a clear fire. He saw something that didn't fit into his worldview. An enemy who saves those who came to kill him. A wall that protects rather than kills. A city that welcomes rather than rejects. His own orcs saw it too. Their wounded comrades were being carried inside the walls. Not into slavery, not to be executed, to be treated. A murmur ran through the ranks. At first it was quiet, then it grew louder. Why are they fighting? For what? Against whom? Against those who were treating their wounded. Gar felt the army slipping from his grasp. He leaped off the boar. He drew a massive two-handed axe. He marched forward, toward the gates, alone. His warriors parted. He walked across the field past bodies, blood, and moans. He walked toward the gates which were open, toward the city that did not fear him. Olga stepped forward. Her sword was at the ready. Groom placed a hand on her shoulder. She stopped. He climbed down from the tower and stepped out through the gates, alone. A frail little oroch, unarmed, unarmored, facing a 3-meter-tall chieftain with a two-handed axe. They stood facing each other, Gar and Groom, Fang and Stone, the old world and the new. Gar raised his axe, high, above his head. Groom didn't move. Gar stood with his axe raised, looking at Groom. A second, 2, 5. Then he lowered the axe, slowly. He thrust it into the ground in front of him. And right into the ground. In front of the gates. In front of his army. In front of the whole world. He said he couldn't kill the one who healed his wounded. That he had no words for it. That the world had broken, and he didn't know how to live in a broken world. Groom sat down beside him, on the cold ground. 2 orcs in front of the open gates. He said the world hadn't broken. The world had grown larger. There was now room in it not only for fangs but also for stone. Not only for blood but also for water. Not only for death but also for life. Gar remained silent. His warriors stood and watched. 7,000 orcs who had come to destroy the city stood and watched as their chieftain sat in the mud next to the one he had come to kill. Then one of Red Fang's warriors threw his axe to the ground. Then a second. Then a third. The sound of falling weapons rippled through the ranks like a wave. What followed happened quickly. The wounded were carried into the city. All of them. Friends and foes alike. Jess worked for 2 days straight without sleep. Groom helped her. He held the instruments. He handed her water. He stitched up simple wounds as she directed. His hands were shaking, but he didn't stop. Gar Bonebreaker died on the 2nd day. Not from his wounds. From poison. His own chieftain had stabbed him in the back with a poisoned knife when he realized that Gar had surrendered. A chieftain who laid down his weapons before the enemy was a disgrace, according to the old law. Groom was there when Gar died. The huge orc lay on the hospital floor, breathing slowly and heavily. The poison was eating away him from the inside. Jess couldn't do anything. There was no antidote. There were no resources. There was only a clean floor, a warm room, and soft light streaming through the window. Gar looked at Groom. His eyes had already glazed over. He said he'd been wrong. Not about the walls. He understood the walls. It was about Groom. He'd thought Groom was building for himself, but Groom was building for everyone, even for those who'd come to kill him. He closed his eyes. His breathing stopped. Groom sat next to the dead chieftain and didn't move. Then he stood up. He walked out of the hospital. He found Gory, Gar's 13-year-old son. The boy was standing by the wall, staring into space. His father was dead. His clan had been shattered. His world had come crashing down. Groom walked up to him. He placed a hand on his shoulder. The boy flinched. He looked up at him. Groom said they had a place for him, and a school. He asked if he would come. Gory looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. A month later, a council was convened. 20 chiefs sat around a round stone table that Groom had designed so that there would be no seat of honor. Everyone was equal. Everyone could see everyone else. Groom did not sit on a throne. No thrones were brought in. He unfurled a large parchment on the table, a charter that he, Mireille, and Hayrin had spent 3 months writing. End. Not a single chieftain. A council. Not the rule of the strong, the rule of law. Nahi read the first line. She stood on a stool because the table was too high. Her voice was clear and steady. She read better than anyone else in town. The first line stated that the peoples of Gur-Un-Tar promised each other a roof over their heads and bread on the table. Everything else would follow. The chiefs listened. They were silent. One by one, they placed their marks on the parchment, palm prints in red dye. 20 prints, 20 tribes, 1 charter. Rika lit a fire on the altar in the new sanctuary. The smoke rose. Clean, even, through the chimney that Groom had built a year ago. She stood by the fire, and her eyes were dry. For the first time in her life as a shaman. Nahi held Groom's hand. Her palm was small and warm. Outside the window lay Kar Groom, a city that was never supposed to exist. A city of fired brick and lime mortar, clean water, and warm stoves. A city that began with a single repaired roof and became home to 1,200 living beings who would never again be prey. Jess stood in the hospital doorway. She looked at Groom across the square. He caught her gaze. With just her lips, she whispered his earthly name, a surname no one had uttered in 3 years. He replied just as quietly. 2 words. We've only just begun. Kargash stood on the tower above the gate. He looked out at the steppe, at the horizon, at a world that had changed and would never be the same again. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, not because he was waiting for an enemy, out of habit. In the square, old Urzel sat by the well and drank water. Clean, cold, well water. His yellow eyes were closed. His face bore a calm that Groom had never seen on him before. Krogar stood at the entrance to the smithy. His enormous hands were folded across his chest. He looked out at the city, at the houses his son had drawn with a stick in the mud and then built out of stone, at the walls that had stopped the army, at the streets where children walked, children who were no longer cold or hungry. Groom stood in the town square of his city. His green hands were thin and weak. His fangs were small. His body was frail. But surrounding him stood the walls he had built, and behind those walls lived the people he had saved. Not with a sword, not with magic, not with strength, with a blueprint, a ditch, a brick, a stove, a chimney, a well. Every stone in this city was an act of care disguised as engineering. He looked up at the sky, gray, endless, the sky of a world that had called to him because someone had to build. He lowered his eyes. He looked at Nahi. She was smiling. A chipped fang jutted out, making her smile crooked and perfect. He squeezed her hand, warm, alive, and he walked over to the drafting table. He still had 20 more ideas.